leave behind ministries. So I have two ministries that I help churches start. One's called Disciples in Motion. It's a recovery ministry for any person with any issue that they have that interferes with their walk with God. So Disciples in Motion is very innovative, and it's a very affirming, Jesus-centered recovery ministry. And then the other thing I do is I do a thing called the grief journey, and I help churches set up grief groups. And so those are my two big things, along with other kinds of mental health workshops that we have going on. So I do want to bring you greetings and just let you know that I'm excited that we have people from all over the world. I saw somebody from Uganda,
Wow.
I think from London, Johannesburg,
Wow.
Madison, Wisconsin. I mean, there's people from everywhere today. So we are called the
Really
International
good
Churches of
disciples.
Christ.
Disciples.
So we're international for sure. So a couple things before we get started. Slide, please. Oh my gosh, I had to introduce you to my family real quick. So that's my family. My son there in the middle lives in China. And then my daughter and her husband just got back to the United States. They had been in China for 10 years, leading a church over there. And they just brought home and had their first little child, my little granddaughter there. That's Elsa. So I had to introduce her to everybody. She's the love of my life right now. Slide, please. So I want to let you know a couple things. First of all, you're at home. Sometimes people would rather just listen and not take notes. So I'm going to give you a chance here. If you get out your cell phones, your smartphones, and if you want to get notes to this class sent to you, you can dial the word in motion, type in motion to 66866. If you just text it there, they will send you an email and tell you how to get on my list, and I'll send you the notes to my classes today. So some people like to just sit back and listen and not take notes. You can get them later on. The other thing, it sets you up to get a weekly blog that I send out on mental health in the church setting. And this is all free. There's no charge or anything. But it gives you the opportunity to get the notes from the class and a weekly blog that I send. Now listen, today we're going to talk about anxiety, and I want to start off to let you know that there is no judgment in the room today. All right, so I know sometimes those of us that struggle with mental health challenges, we can feel kind of judged by others. I'm going to say right off the bat that I struggle with anxiety myself, even to the point where a while back I needed to take medication for it. So I want you to know that there is no judgment here. We're just here to help each other. And if you're maybe if you're a little bit skeptical about mental health, I want to ask you just to listen. And if you don't struggle with mental health, I want you to think about those that you love around you that do struggle with it and how you can help them out. So today is actually for people that that do struggle and people that simply want to help others out. Um, so we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide here, and we'll begin to talk about the challenges in front of us. So as you know, we're all dealing with COVID-19. What a interesting time in the world. I don't think the world's ever gone through something that has impacted every human in the world at the same time that I can think of. Even the wars that we've been through, this thing has impacted every single nation, and it's brought on and exposed a lot of different issues in our lives. You know, COVID-19 has exposed fear in many of our lives. A lot of us are fearful of our futures. We're not quite sure what's going on. Many of us are fearful for our very lives. Some of us are up in our 60s now, and you know, we're like that high-risk group. So there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of anxiety going on, and depression for many of us. So this has been a challenging time. And I want to simply acknowledge that if that's what you're feeling, join the crew, right? I mean, we're all going through different issues with this. Now, I will say there's some of us, though, that kind of like this. At the very beginning, I was kind of happy that I get to be in my house all day long, and as an introverted person, I kind of enjoyed the idea of not having to be around people. But that lasted all of about a week or two, and now I'm at a place where I'm kind of struggling with it myself. Um, Today, we're going to talk about anxiety, but it doesn't mean that that's all that we're talking about, because anxiety and depression, some people call them cousins. In other words, they have very similar features to them that when we're working on getting better, the things that help us in anxiety also help us with depression or fear. So no matter what you struggle with mental health wise, this is going to be helpful to you today. So next slide, please. One thing I want to remind us about is that God totally understands what's going on. God's got this. God has not been taken by surprise. It's not a recent phenomenon that people have anxiety and depression. God knows all about it. As a matter of fact, in a minute, I'm going to explain to you how God invented these two things as useful features in our lives. God created us to have anxiety and depression for different reasons. So God knows all about anxiety. I think the challenge for us is for us to know about our anxiety. Psalm 139, verse 23 says this: Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. You see, God already knows our anxious thoughts. God's very aware. The point here is, do we know our anxious thoughts? Are we aware of where they come from and how we resolve these? Next slide, please. You see, anxiety has been around for a long time, as has depression. And like I said, God invented these things. They're normal parts of the human condition. And I want to tell you why God invented anxiety. First of all, he invented it for our safety, which we'll talk about for a few minutes today. Without anxiety, we'd get eaten by bears. Well, maybe we wouldn't, but back in the day, we'd get eaten by bears. Without anxiety, we would have some serious car accidents happen. You're driving down the road, and out of the corner of your eye, you notice a big dump truck on its way to slam into you. What happens? When you see that dump truck 3 or 4 seconds away from hitting you, what do? Do you stop and think, what should I do now? I wonder what I should do. You don't do that. What happens is your anxiety brain takes over, and you go into automatic um, safety measures. Your eyes get really big, and your hand automatically turns the steering wheel to the left to avoid the collision. That's called the anxiety brain. God created it in us for our safety. Let's say you're driving down the road and you look down and you notice that your gas tank is on empty. What do? If you're like me, you start looking to save a penny per gallon down the road a bit more. But what happens is, as you drive down the street and your gas tank gets further and further onto empty, you get more and more anxious. Your gut kind of starts swelling up a little bit, and you feel those butterflies in your gut. That's God's way of getting you to have action. Perhaps you have an exam tomorrow that you have to study for, or a project at work, and you start feeling those anxious feelings. That's simply God getting you to act. So anxiety is something that's been produced in us in order for us to get action going. How about depression? Well, depression was created in us for creativity features in our life. I don't know if you've noticed this, but most of the most famous actors, writers, songwriters, singers, musicians, the creators among us actually have melancholic personalities. Many of them struggle with depression in different ways. And what happens is, it's that because depression enables us to go inside and look at our souls. And that's why these people do such a great job of creating, is because they have some features of depression that allow them to do that. Without depression, we wouldn't know how to get rest. Sometimes depression indicates to us that we need rest. Here's another thing, guys. Anxiety and depression are features in our life that lead us to humility. When I was a young person, I thought I had everything going on and I could do anything I wanted to. And then when I had my first panic attack with anxiety, the first time I had one of those, it humbled me. It made me realize that I am not all about what I thought I was. And then finally, when we have mental health challenges, it gives us an opportunity for growth. Here's what James says about that. He says, consider it pure joy in James chapter 1. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you face trials of many kinds. Why? Because the testing of our faith leads to change. You see, I would like to grow myself by simply sitting in front of my fireplace in the morning with my Bible and my cup of coffee. And I certainly need those times, right? But that's not usually how I grow. I usually grow by challenges that present themselves in my life that cause me to rely on God. So these are sometimes opportunities for us to grow. Next slide, please. As we wait for the next slide, as we know, thank you, James. As we know, oftentimes, even though these things were created to help us, they get to be too much. In other words, as you know, if those of us that struggle with mental health challenges, um, as you know, they can overwhelm us, they can overflow into our lives and become very dangerous. So here's some of the challenges and dangers that we should be aware of with mental health challenges. Number one, um, is there's suicide and self-harm. Guys, I want you to know that in the International Churches of Christ, we've had too many suicides among us. I work with many people who have lost loved ones to suicide um, or that are struggling with self-harm. I want you to know to please be aware of that amongst yourselves. When you hear people talk about suicide, um, please, please, please take it seriously. Always let somebody know other than you that your friend has discussed suicide and do it immediately. In other words, don't judge the person and say, well, maybe we can wait till tomorrow. We always want to pay attention to that um, as it happens. So I have much more to say about that, but not enough time. But anxiety and depression can cause suicide and self-harm. Next uh, point, please. Another thing is distrust. When we struggle with suicide or we struggle with challenges like anxiety and depression, it can cause distrust. We can begin to distrust other people and those that are trying to help us, the church, and sometimes we begin to distrust God. We begin to ask God the kinds of questions that indicate a lack of faith and a lack of trust in God. So we want to make sure that we're aware of that as well. And then a final challenge and danger, next point please, is we can become discouraged and isolated. And this one is probably one of the most damaging of all, is there's a lot of shame attached to anxiety and depression and other mental health challenges. In other words, we can get really discouraged about ourselves, and then we can actually get discouraged about God's goodness in our life, and we become isolated. And I want you to think about those that you're closest to, and first of all, make sure you never, ever, ever judge them. Um, we People with mental health challenges already feel judged enough. They don't need other people to judge them. So always take that seriously and look for those that are being isolated. If you struggle with these kinds of issues, please be aware of the isolation temptation. It's much easier just to be by ourselves, but we need a social environment around us. It's one of the greatest needs of recovery is other people. Okay, slide please. All right, so let's jump in, and I want to share with you a couple thoughts about anxiety. And this one's really interesting to me. I call this the irony of anxiety. Here's the irony of anxiety. We just got through discussing that anxiety is actually a God-given trait meant to protect us. I want you to think about that for just a minute. That your brain, it's a very complex organ in our body. You can talk to Dr. Irby about this because he's smarter than I am on this one. But our brains are amazing. I mean, they're just the most complex computer ever invented. And I know a little bit about them, but not much. But I do know this is the anxiety part of our brain was designed to protect us from danger, right? So think about it. The job of anxiety is protection. And what it does, the brain scans the environment for danger. It's always looking for danger. And if it sees danger, it gets your body ready to protect yourself. A couple months ago, I was at a retreat in the Rocky Mountains for college students, and I was speaking there, and I left at about 10:30 at night to go back to my cabin, and it was all dark and everything, and I was walking behind these cabins on my way back, and I remembered I saw a sign that day that said, "Beware, there's bears in the area." Okay, so we're out in the middle of the Rocky Mountains, and when I remembered that sign about bears in the area, and here I am out in the dark, the hair on the back of my neck started sticking up, and my whole body tensed up. What was that? That was my anxious brain saying, "Hey, Tim, be aware." My eyes got big. I was on the lookout for these bears. I never did see one, thankfully. But that is what our brain does. It tries to protect us. But what happens is sometimes we overdo it. And we start trying to protect ourselves in places that we don't need to be protected. We need to take risk. Let me give you an example of this. Let's say you're in a classroom and you're a student and the teacher's teaching and they start teaching on stuff that you're confused. You don't know what they're saying and you need help, right? So what you should do is raise your hand and ask for help. That would be the logical thing to do. What do we do though? We get scared and anxious and we won't raise our hand. We'll actually not raise our hand, and the teacher continues to teach, and we continue to be more and more confused, and then we don't learn the material because we didn't raise our hand. We're trying to protect ourselves during a time that we shouldn't be protecting ourselves. You know, life is such that there's times we've got to take risk. And that's an example of when you don't raise your hand, you don't want to take a risk, you're protecting yourself when you shouldn't. And what happens is later on you have an exam over that material, and the very thing you're protecting yourself from happens. You're not smart. In other words, you didn't learn the material. You were afraid that if you raise your hand, everybody would think you're stupid, right? I've done that before. I don't want to raise my hand because then everybody thinks I'm dumb. And in the end of the day, I become dumb because I didn't learn what I needed to learn. It's ironic that when our brain's there to protect us, it actually doesn't protect us. So there are times when you need to take a risk and not give in to your anxious brain. When you're not in physical danger, it still feels dangerous, but it's not. So that's the irony of anxiety. Here's another time that it happens. Let's say you're in a social situation and there's 4 or 5 or 6 of you standing around and you want to say something, but once again, fear overcomes you and you won't say something. And then you learn to not say stuff because you're giving in to the fear of anxiety. And what happens to a person in a social situation that doesn't say much? Well, they can be perceived as kind of aloof or arrogant. And what that does, it makes the social situation even more difficult. People may begin to withdraw from you. So see, the very thing that you want to see happen, be more social, doesn't happen. It's called the irony of anxiety. Next slide, please. The paradox of anxiety. Here's another interesting phenomenon, the paradox of anxiety. You guys know what a paradox is. A paradox is the opposite of what you think is supposed to happen. So here's the paradox of anxiety is the more you avoid taking risk, the harder it gets to ever take a risk. So once again, let's go back to our two examples, raising the hand in the classroom or speaking up in a social situation. The more often you decide not to raise your hand, the more difficult it becomes later to raise your hand. It's almost like you're discipling yourself to not do something. Maybe you've done that in reaching out to other people. Maybe you're like me. Sometimes it's kind of hard to reach out to people because you're scared of them. You're scared of what they might say. And you know what happens? The more you give into that fear, the harder it gets later on to reach out to somebody. Same thing in that social environment, right? Every time you decide not to speak up and not to become part of a social circle, the next time you want to do it, it becomes harder. So that's called the paradox of anxiety. The more you give into it, the harder things become. So what we want to do as we continue on this workshop now is instead of avoiding our anxiety, what the research is telling us now is we want to conquer it. We want to engage our anxiety. So as I counsel people, I counsel high school students and college students. As we counsel people, we're helping them to engage and conquer their anxiety. Next slide, please. You know, you might say, hey, Tim, you don't know me. This stuff is all over my body. It's all over my mind. It's all over me. It's like who I am. I got it. And you know what? I'm sorry. We all have our challenges, right? I'm with you on this stuff. I don't know where my anxiety came from. I don't remember asking for it. It just was there. So here's a quote that's really helped me in my life. Is it says, I can't change the direction of the wind, but I can adjust my sails to always reach my destination. Here's the thing, church. We can't do anything about what's been given to us by God. I can't explain it. I just know that some of us, actually all of us, have different challenges in different ways. There's not a single person in this chat room. There's over 200 of you guys right now out there. There's not a single person out there who doesn't have some specific challenge that's kind of kicking you around a little bit, right? We all have it. Counselors, ministers, everybody's got challenges. We can't do anything about the ones that are given to us, but we can always adjust our sails. We can always react in a godly way to reach the destinations we look for. I think it was Chuck Swindoll once said, life is 90% of no, he said challenges are 90% of what's wait, let me back up one more time. Sorry. He said life is 10% of the challenges that come our way and 90% of how we react to those. Okay. Sorry about that. I had a little brain freeze there for a second. 90% of life is how we react to stuff that goes on around us. You know, we can't deal with the 10% that we have no control over, but we do have control over how we react. So I want to close out the workshop today. Next slide, please. Talking about some of the ways we can react to what's going on in our life. Here's some things I want to ask you about, guys. Here we are stuck inside our homes, maybe for a while now, right? We just don't know what it's going to be like here in the next couple of months. But I was sitting outside this morning in my quiet time thinking about this. I personally believe that God has a message for us in this COVID-19 time. And here's the message. Psalm 46:10, he says, be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. I think there's a message here. I think God's trying to teach us right now to be still and to consider him. You know, God is in control of this COVID-19 thing. God's not up in heaven scrambling right now trying to figure it all out. God's got it down. He knows all about it. He created this world around us. He's totally in control. His message for us today is be still. Now listen, I've been in the ICOC now for about 40 years, most of my life. And I'm going to say something. Some of you guys may not like this, but I'm going to say it anyways. Um, I think when you get older, you're allowed to say things that nobody likes. So be patient with me for a second. I believe that the ICOC in some ways was built on a humanistic and kind of a work-centered mentality. Now that's not all bad, okay? God used it, and we were able to plant churches all over this world in ways that I've never seen before. So it's not all bad. But I think one of the things that we've had to learn over the last several years is that God has to be in control. In other words, God's in charge of this whole thing. We're simply his servants here. So one of the things I believe happens right now is that we can be still much more often and reflect on God. And just remember that God's in control. Here's another thought for us, guys. How about every week are we taking the Sabbath? Now, I know a lot of people go, yeah, that's for the Old Testament. You know, the Sabbath day in Exodus 20, the Bible says, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. It's one of the 10 commandments. Do you know that it's the only commandment that God's given us that we don't believe in? All the other ones, do not murder, do not steal, all the other ones are like, amen to that, right? This is the commandment that God wrote the most about. If you go back and look in Exodus 20, all the other ones are like one sentence long, and then this one's like a paragraph. God took a lot of time to remind us that every single week we need to take time to rest. That's not the American way, you guys. Many of us, and myself included, we have a struggle resting during the week. We have a struggle taking the time to rest. And here's my question. What message do we give God when we don't take a Sabbath? When we don't rest, we have a message we're giving God. Here's the message is God, you're not enough. I have to keep busy. You're not enough to take care of me. And so we work ourselves to the bone and we don't take rest to be with God. So I want to challenge you guys on that one today. I want you to think about taking time every week to have a Sabbath time. I don't know what you do with that. That's your call. And I don't know how long it is. I know people that take a Sabbath for a couple hours on Monday. But I want to ask all of you to consider taking time every week to simply rest and think about your God. And then finally, here's one. Just encourage you with your quiet times every morning. The sovereign Lord has given me a well-instructed tongue to know the word that sustains the weary. He wakens me. How often? Morning by morning. Wakens my ear to listen like one being instructed. Boy, I just want to remind all of us that every morning, getting out of bed and spending that time being instructed by God, there's just nothing like it. So let's see if God doesn't speak to you. Next slide, please. So here's a couple thoughts as we close out today on how we can deal with anxiety and depression during these times. I want to tell you about two different areas that we want to do. We want to spend time with calming strategies. And then after we've kind of learned those and practiced those during the day, we want to go what's called coping strategies. So calming strategies have to happen before we learn how to cope. Sometimes we go straight to coping before we calm. Now, the goal of a calming strategy is this. When we feel anxious, this is very important, so listen up on this one. When we feel anxious, our brain goes into fight or flight mode or freeze. It happens all the time. Think about it. Those of you that are married, you're having a regular day with your wife or your husband, and all of a sudden you're entering into one of those bump times, right? And what happens is, even in a bump or an argument, our minds can go right to anxiety to protect us. And we go into fight, flight, or freeze. And we might say something or do something that later on we regret. Have you ever done that where you say something or do something, and then like an hour later you think, oh man, I should have done this, or I should have said this, it would have been much better. Why'd that happen? Because we're giving in to our anxious brain when we shouldn't give into it. So let's look at Jesus, because Jesus was perfect at that. Jesus had an anxious brain. He had a brain that allowed him to protect himself because he was all 100% human as well as 100% God. He was also all man. He was the son of man. So here's an example of a time where Jesus was able to calm himself down. You guys all remember the situation where um, the Pharisees, they caught this woman in the act of adultery. So picture this, they grab this woman by the arms and they pull her out of a home where apparently she had been having an adulterous affair, and they grabbed her and they threw her down on the ground in front of Jesus. And they pointed at her and they said, Jesus, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law says that we should stone such women. What do you say? Now think about Jesus for a second. Here he is. He has three major challenges in front of him. Number one challenge, he has to have compassion on this hurting woman, right? That's what Jesus was all about, was having compassion on hurting people. Number two, he had a law that he had written that he needed to uphold. And then number three, he had a group of self-righteous men who he loved dearly that he had to help them to overcome their self-righteousness so that they could maybe find God. Jesus had three major issues in 1 second. You can imagine what his anxious brain was doing at that moment. It could have been saying, maybe it was telling Jesus, just get up and walk away. Like, just get out of there. Let them deal with this stuff. His anxious brain might have said, maybe you need to rebuke this woman and kind of be done with it. Just rebuke her for her sin. Maybe Jesus's anxious brain was saying, oh my gosh, the law does say stone such women. Maybe I should be the first one to throw a stone at her. Or maybe his anxious brain was saying, just yell at the Pharisees and get rid of them. Jesus had an anxious brain to deal with. So what does he do? He bends over and he begins to doodle in the dirt. He just starts writing something. You know, all my friends are like, what did he write? I want to know what he wrote. I tell them, I don't think he wrote anything. That's just my opinion. I think he just doodled in the dirt. Why did he do that? Because he needed to divorce from his anxious brain and access his logical brain. He had to get into the brain that can think logically for a few seconds. So what did he do? He just divorced himself from the situation and bent over and doodled. As a matter of fact, he did it twice. That indicates to me that maybe he stood up after the first time and he wasn't quite ready, so he went down again to doodle in the dirt. And then he gets up, and as awesome as Jesus is, he does the perfect thing. He asked two questions that solved all three problems. He looked at these guys and he said, which one of you guys has never sinned before? You throw the first stone, okay? And it's such a great question. And the old guys dropped their rocks right away and walked away. And the young guys kind of stood there with the rocks trying to figure it out. And then they dropped their rocks as well. So the first thing Jesus did, he took care of those guys and their self-righteousness. They had to go back and figure their own lives out there. And then he looked at this woman and he said, where did they go? Has no one condemned you? Then neither do I. He accomplished the second need, was having compassion on a hurting person. And then thirdly, he was able to uphold the law that he had written. You see, Jesus took time to calm his anxious brain down in order to do what needed to be done. It's a great lesson for all of us. So I want to ask you to think about times in your lives where you can figure out ways of calming down. You can do it through your body, through breathing exercises, through stretching exercises, sometimes just tensing up all your muscles for about 20 seconds and then letting them go is a great way to calm yourself. Many of us know about mindfulness exercising, and humor is a great way to calm your brain down. Working with your different senses like music, lotions, and scents, or even journaling and venting can be different ways of calming yourself down so that you can do what's right. So, next slide, please. And by the way, these are things that we should practice when we're not anxious. All those things we just discussed, those are things that we should be practicing on a weekly, daily basis, so that when the anxiety does come along, then we're ready to face it. So now we're going to get into coping skills. So we've talked about calming, and now it's coping. What are some things we can do? Well, one thing you can always do is you can question and challenge your anxiety. Psalm 42, the psalmist questioned his anxiety. He said, "Hey, why, my soul, are you downcast? Why so disturbed within me?" You know, instead of just giving into anxiety and giving into depression, it's really important to question it. Why am I depressed today? God, help me understand my depression. God, why am I so anxious? Please teach me about my anxiety. You know, all of us have the Holy Spirit. If you're a Christian today, you have the Holy Spirit living inside of you, inside of your heart. And He's a great person to question. So I do that all the time. Holy Spirit, teach me, why am I feeling this way? What's going on inside me? Help me understand myself. I mean, you have the resource of the Holy Spirit living right inside your life. Next slide, please. So coping strategies, you can argue with your anxiety brain, just like Jesus did. Jesus kind of argued with anxiety brain. You know, his anxiety brain's like, hey, rebuke the Pharisees. Hey, let this woman go. Hey, rebuke the woman. His anxiety brain is coming up with all sorts of solutions. You can argue with it. So one of the things you do with anxiety is argue with it. So one of the ways I argue with my anxiety brain is I think about the risk versus the reward consequences. In other words, for instance, if you want to get on an airplane, this actually happened to me a while back, and my anxiety brain said, "Tim, don't get on that airplane; it might crash." And um, and then my logical brain stepped in and said, "Yeah, but they never crash. I mean, the statistics are amazing." But then my anxiety argued back, like, "Yeah, but it might." So then I argued back and said, okay, well, risk versus reward. It's much more rewarding that I get where I want to get to than the minor risk I'm taking. So we can actually argue with our anxiety brain and have a logical conversation with ourselves in order to do what we want to do. We can work on negotiation exposure, and I won't get into that too much, but if you really struggle with anxiety, you might want to find a professional counselor that's an expert in negotiation exposure. And that's basically where they expose you little by little to the subject of your fear. And they help you overcome your fear little by little. And then finally, another coping strategy is to simply appeal to courage. In other words, when you're feeling anxious or depressed and you have a goal in front of you, you can appeal to courage and say, "Courage, because of my morals, because of my goals and my motivations, I'm going to go ahead and do something that feels very unnatural today. I'm going to obey the morals, goals, and motivations that I have in my life." And as you know, that takes courage. Next slide, please. So as we finish up today, I want to remind you something. Ed Welch, one of my favorite authors, said this: "The best stories are not those of victory over struggles, but of a stubborn faith in the midst of them." You know, I want to let you guys know I'm not all that inspired really by somebody that stands in front of me and he says, "Hey, look at me. I've overcome everything. I'm going great now." Those guys don't inspire me as much as the person who says, "Hey, I'm in the middle of a struggle, but I've got stubborn faith in the middle of that struggle, and I'm going to keep working through it." I get so inspired by those of you that have major struggles in your lives, but you're faithful. You're still giving, you're still loving, you still serve other people. You're fighting the battles. Those people super inspire me. I want you to know that you're an inspiration. If you're in the middle of a struggle, you're an inspiration to other people. Next slide, please. So go ahead and hit the next 4 on this. I want to remind you guys that right now during this COVID-19, the people that are doing the very best in our nation and around the world are those that are members of churches or some other faith community. Those people have the best opportunities to do well. One more, by the way. So, so just remember, in the church setting, take advantage of every opportunity you have. Make sure that you're in a safe and confidential environment, you guys. Make sure that people that you're talking to are holding your conversations in confidence. And I can go into that at another time, but it's super important that we practice safety and confidentiality with each other. I want to remind you that you're accepted in church. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter how long you've been a Christian. It doesn't matter what you did before you're Christian. And it really doesn't even matter what kind of sin you're struggling with now. You're accepted in the Lord's church. You're cared for. People care for you in the Lord's church. I want you to remember that sometimes those of us that have been around a while, we're kind of used to all this, but you're cared for. You have purpose, right? Boy, one of the greatest ways to have recovery in our lives is to remember the purpose that God's given us. We have a purpose to change other people's lives. And boy, I wish I had time to tell you about the men and women in my life over the last 40 years that have had purpose in my life, that have given me the opportunity to become what I want to become. We have purpose to change people's lives. And then finally, you're an important member of the church, okay? You're important. It doesn't matter. Those of you that struggle a lot, God actually says you're more important than Irby and Warren, all right? He does. He says it. He says, listen, those that seem less important are actually more important. God actually says, I can't do without you guys. He says, he uses the word indispensable. It's in 1 Corinthians 14, I think, somewhere in there. He says the people that have big struggles are actually indispensable members of the church. He says, I can't do without you guys. So if you're struggling today, remember that you're super important. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, a few more suggestions. Go ahead and hit these, James. I think there's 4 of them. A couple more suggestions, and these will be in our notes, so just hold on. Make sure you're getting exercise and sleep. If you're not sleeping, guys, nothing else works well, just to let you know. Sleep is essential to our well-being. You cannot replace it. You don't get to catch up on sleep. The research is very clear that that you need your sleep, or you're just not going to get better. If you're interested in getting into like anxious thoughts and trying to figure out how to deal with an anxious thought, Google the word thought record. Just Google it. And it's a really simple activity you can do to kind of parse through your thinking. And maybe I can talk about that at another time. Make sure you shape your environment. So if you're an alcoholic, you don't want to get a job in a bar, right? That's not a good environment for you. Some of us are anxious because we listen to too much radio and we watch too much stuff on politics, stuff that we can't change. So shape your environment. In other words, look around your environment and ask yourself, is this the most conducive environment for me? Is this what helps me get better? Is this a godly place? You know, there's times I've had to turn my radio off because of the politics I hear on radio. And it just doesn't do me any good. It just makes me angry and mad, and I can't do a thing about it. So I just turn it off. Learn to shape your environment. One more there, James. Make sure you're socially connected, guys. You have to be with other people. It's just the way God made us, to be with other people. So stay socially connected. And then finally, nurture a dream. And I always tell people this at Disciples in Motion that are going through recovery. is make sure you have a dream for God that's bigger than you are. Okay. Next one. Okay. So in conclusion, I wrote down a couple of New York City resources. There's an organization called NAMI, N-A-M-I. It's the National Alliance on Mental Illness. It's a great organization. It's a nationwide group, but they also have local chapters. So if you want more information or find out about workshops, Google them, NAMI. In Hudson Valley, there's a Hudson Valley Mental Health, which is a community-minded mental health facility. And I believe they have like a sliding scale for those that can't afford counseling. In Harlem, there's one called the Hope Center, which is Harlem's free mental health care. There's a lot of other agencies like that, but I just found a couple today. And then always check with your insurance, find out what they offer for resources. And then one more slide, I believe, or two more. I'm running out of time here, so it's Ryan's fault, by the way. I knew I'd get him to laugh. Okay, in conclusion, guys, recognize and own your problem. You know, you may not have been the source of the problem, but if it's a problem in your life, we always want to recognize what it is and we want to own it. If we don't own our problem, then we're never going to resolve it. So you always want to own the problem you've got in your life. Number two, create a social network around you. Make sure that you've got people that are going to listen to you and that are going to be there when you're struggling. Number three, educate and advocate. One of the things I ask people to do that I counsel is I ask them to become experts in their problem. So if you're struggling with anxiety, depression, other things, find out more and more about it, get books, you become an expert. And what will happen is it'll help your recovery, but then you're also going to be an expert for other people that struggle later on. You're going to be that kind of helper to help them through. And then finally, develop and execute a self-help plan that's got short and long-term goals. In other words, find daily and weekly goals, and then come up with like an annual goal for yourself. Goals are super important. Next slide. Trust in God at all times, people. Pour out your heart to Him, for God is our refuge. Let me just encourage you at the end of the day to always go to God with these issues. God's got it. God cares about us. He deeply loves us, and He wants to help us recover from the challenges that we have. So please go to Him and trust in Him at all times. So that's our workshop for right now for the anxiety side of it. I think we're going to take a bit of a break, and then we're going to jump into a grief journey workshop. So I'm going to turn it back over to Ryan or James and let them navigate from here.
So I just want to say a huge thank you to Tim for that workshop. Just fantastic. Totally appreciated the biblical emphasis, the focus on Jesus. The practicals were awesome. I mean, the coping, the calming, and then, lots that you shared afterwards. I knew this would be great. And that's one of the reasons that we asked you to do this for us. So a huge thank you to Tim for that. And so we are going to take a break, and the break is going to be, I believe, until, when are we coming back together? 3 o'clock, I think, something like that. And so, feel free to get up, move around, do what you got to do, reflect on, some of the things that Tim shared, and then we'll come back and do our second workshop, which will be focused on grief. So, so let's go ahead and take a break, and then we'll come back in a little bit. Thanks, Tim.
Guys, can we do 2:30? Is that okay?
Yeah, 2:30 is good with me.
2:30?
Yeah.
That's
so
great.
We'll keep it open. I'm pretty sure people will have questions that they would love to ask. So
sure.
At what point would you like to do that, Tim?
I can do that right now, guys. I'm good.
Okay, so everyone else, unless you have a question, you can take a 20 20-minute break and come back. But if anyone has a question, if you can just raise your hand, we'll try to get to as many as possible, and hopefully give Tim a chance to take a break himself before we start the next half of our session. So is there anyone who has a question for Dr. Sumerlin? Scrolling through.
Yeah, I'm looking through the chat right now.
Okay. You can type your question in the chat as well, so it might be a little easier.
I see some questions about medication in there. One was just the connection between trusting God and taking medication, and should we, those that do take medication, should we work to get off our medication? So maybe that's a good place to start.
Sure, yeah, that's a great question, guys. Let me talk about medication for a little bit, okay? It's a big, kind of a big topic, kind of controversial in our churches. I've been in some churches, so I get to travel all over the place and do these workshops. And I've actually been in churches where it's kind of divided the church up a bit. There's like half the church says, nope, medication's evil and bad, and it tells you that you're not obeying God. And then other people are much more like, you know, we take medication for all sorts of things, right? So so it's kind of a controversial issue. So I'm gonna give you my take on it, okay? And you can do what you want with it. Basically, I believe that medication can be super helpful. I've known many people that have found great relief by taking medication. I've known people where medication has saved their life. It's obvious that without it, they would have either killed themselves or they would have been miserable the rest of their lives. So I've seen medication become a really useful tool. So here's the way I look at it, though. Medication for mental health is much more of an art than it is a science. And let me explain that to you. I have a little bit of a high blood pressure problem. So my doctor gives me medication for high blood pressure, and it's a science. He can take my blood pressure, put numbers into the computer, and it'll spit out exactly what dose of medication I should take. And when I take the medication for my heart, it does exactly what it's supposed to do, right? That's a science. Mental health is not like that. Mental health is much more of an art with medication. In other words, they're going to suggest something to you. They're going to ask you to take it. They're going to tell you that it takes about 6 weeks for it to kind of get into your system and do its work. And then they're going to ask you for feedback. So in that way, it's much more of an art. And normally what happens is people will come back after 6 weeks and say, it's really going well, or they might say, no, it's not good. The side effects are horrible, or maybe it helps me a little bit, but not much. Or even sometimes they say it helps me too much, you know? And so then the doctor can adjust it, and they can kind of up it or down it a little bit, or even change the medication itself. So the key with medication is that you're the person, the client is a person in charge of it. In other words, you're telling the doctor what's working, what's not working. And the other thing about medication, it never solves your problem. It's not there to solve anxiety, depression. What it does, it gets you back up to ground zero where everybody else gets to operate from. So it doesn't resolve your anxiety or depression. It simply gets you in a place where you get to do life the way everybody else gets to do life. Does that make sense? So you still have to you still got to deal with the world around you, the anxious and the depressed world around you, and the way that works in your life, but it helps mitigate or lower the effects of that problem in your life so you can operate. So so yeah, I would encourage you, if you're on medication, to stay on it, to please do what your doctor tells you to do, but also be very involved with your doctor about how it's working for you. And Like with myself, I'll just be honest with you. With my medication, I was taking it to get on an airplane. I had a real problem with flying, and with in motion, I fly an awful lot. I go quite a bit. So I was taking medication just to get on an airplane. But what I did is I started using that medication less and less. And I remember one time I even forgot to take it, and I got on the airplane like, oh my gosh, I forgot my medication. And by that time I was already on the airplane. I thought, okay, I got on there without my medication, so I'm going to start weaning myself off of it. And that's what I did. I just got to the place where I didn't need it anymore. Um, so it kind of got me over a hump in my life. Um, Other people need it, take it for a lifetime. I know a good friend of mine at work, she takes anxiety medication every day, and it kind of helps her kind of keep living in some ways. So that's my answer. I know it doesn't answer every part of that, but that's kind of my overall take on medication. I'm just looking at, at what point should I get help with my sleeping and eating are irregular? Oh, wow. Um, that's a good question. And first of all, I'm sorry about that because I've had the same thing with sleeping issues. And boy, when your sleep is not going well, it is damaging. Um, I've got a good friend who his sleep has not gone well for 20, 30 years now, and he's a wreck at times. What I would say about sleep is just you've got to keep fighting for it. You've got to keep figuring out ways, keep going to the doctors, keep reading books. Um, you got to do everything possible to get your sleep back in order. Let me share with you guys something real quick about things like this that are very stubborn. Um, Sometimes when we have stubborn problems like sleep or like anxiety, I'm going to give you an analogy here for you, okay? So I told you about my flying problem with anxiety, but I had another problem with flying, and it was with my ears. I've got ears that have too small of the eustachian tube. And what was happening was about every other time that I was landing in an airplane, my ears would literally explode. Like, honestly, guys, I can't describe how painful it was. It felt like somebody was jabbing a knife into my head, like an ice pick into my ear. It was so painful. And it would take about 20 or 25 minutes as we landed for the pain to go away. And at the very end, they would pop, and which was excruciating in itself. But on the way down, it was maddening. I would be crying, stomping my feet on the ground. It was really difficult. So I got to a point where I thought I can't fly anymore. I can't go through this anymore. So then I started reading up on it and getting advice, and everybody had their little thing they gave me. Everybody had like hey Tim, use these earplugs, they're magic, or take this little red pill, or chew gum, or chew ice, or chew candy, things like that. And I tried every one of those things, and it didn't help me any, and it was really frustrating. And then one day at work, I talked to my school nurse about it, and I told her what was happening. I said, none of these things work for me. And she just looked at me and smiled, and she said, Tim, do all of them at the same time. Do them all at once. And I thought, I've never thought of that. I just tried each one individually. So the next time I got on an airplane, I had this little packet of like all the different things in one little box. And before we start landing, I do them all at one time, like all the different things, about 5 of them. I chew gum, I take red pills, I put these special earplugs in. Um, um, I took ibuprofen. I mean, I just did all these different things at once, and it worked. And it's worked for me for 2.5 years now. I've been able to fly, and I just have to do this every time. So sometimes when we have major struggles that just are persistent, we have to do everything at once. Like we have to do every resource we can come up with at the same time. So we have to take medication. We have to talk to our friends about it. We have to read books about it. We have to pray about it. We have to read the scriptures about it. We have to do everything that we know all at the same time. And oftentimes what I find is that when we do everything at once, we find some resolution to our problems. So that person that just emailed me the question about grief and anxiety and sleeping problems, I would encourage you to dive in with every single resource you have available to relieve those problems. Good question. Thank you.
Amen. Thanks for those questions, and thanks, Tim. We do want to give Tim just a 10-minute break at this point. So it's 2:20 Eastern Standard Time. And so we'll come back in 10 minutes, and then we'll start the grief portion of the workshop. So
sounds good. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks. So we'll see you back in a minute.
Here's a question. What is the best approach to help someone who says they have anxiety but will not go to a doctor for help? Wow. Well, I think probably there's a couple thoughts here. One is I would probably explore a little bit about the issue with the doctor, like why won't they go to a doctor? And I'd listen very carefully to that. I respect people have different reasons. So I would ask a lot of questions and find out kind of some of the reasoning behind not going to doctors. Sometimes we won't go do something because maybe we had a relative, it didn't go well for them or something. And I just let people know, like, hey, if somebody else didn't do well, that doesn't mean you won't. Or maybe they had a previous bad situation with a doctor, and so now they've kind of written all doctors off. So I would listen closely to find out their reasoning. And then the other thought I have is sometimes maybe things just have to get bad enough to where they're ready to be motivated enough to go do things like that. But I'm always wanting to be patient with people. I always want to let people know that I'm here to help you, and I'm going to go at your pace to help you to figure this thing out. So, oh, I see Anne Marie both is on today. Just got on. Hi, Anne Marie. That's cool. I know her from my class I teach. Good. Another question? I'm allergic to so many medication. Don't want to try any more new ones. Fearing more side effects. Doctor presses it. What do I do? Wow. Now, guys, I'm not a medical doctor, so please take my answer to this with a couple grains of salt. One of the things I would do is I'd probably see if your doctor can do an overall evaluation on all the medications that you're on. I remember years ago, my grandmother was on quite a few medications, and she started getting really sick. And what had happened was they had quit, all of her doctors had quit communicating with each other. So she was just on too many medications. And finally, one doctor looked at the whole thing, and they were like, yeah, we need to pull this back. We need to pull this one back. And they just were able to minimize the number of medications she was on, and it really helped her a lot. So one thing I'd do is I would definitely ask your doctor to do an overall evaluation of your medication. And then I would have some conversations around, the anxiety or whatever it is you're dealing with. And if you have too many medications, maybe anxiety medication may not be in the cards for you right now. You may need to look at maybe cognitive behavioral therapy or something along those lines to mitigate the anxiety. So I hope that helps you. By the way, if you're able to see the screen and you were not able to text that word to get on the list, you can always shoot me an email. This is especially for those that are overseas. You can always shoot me an email at timothysumerlin@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to put you on the list, just like everybody else. So, are there any tests that can be taken to know if there is a mental ailment or just general life stresses? No, I don't know of any like biological tests. Generally speaking, you know that you've got an issue. There's a couple ways. Number one, a doctor can evaluate you, and going to a psychologist or psychiatrist, they have a manual called the DSM, that they can diagnose your problem. But what I would say for you is when your problem begins to alter your life, in other words, when your anxiety or your depression begins to push you around in a way that interrupts your normal life patterns and your normal life activity, then you probably need to go get some help on it. So that's kind of the barometer that I use with people, is how much is it affecting what you normally do or want to do? And that's how you know that you've got a problem.
Tim, we're back. It's 2:47. I know James and Ryan, I think, are on the line, and people may have starting to join.
Great.
James or Ryan, do you want to, is there an intro to the second piece, or do we just dive right in?
Let's dive right in.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, who's
Tim
my
is on a
slide?
roll. Let him go. Let him keep going.
That's easy for you to say, James.
Right.
Brother's back there drinking a cup of coffee, man. Shoot. Yeah, let's do it. And who's my slide guy?
I'm out. Are you set up or you need me?
I got it.
All right.
You guys tell me when.
I just need about 60 seconds. But if you want to start talking, fine, go ahead.
Okay. All right, everybody. Hey, welcome back. Hope you had a good break. And boy, what a joy to talk with you guys. I want to tell you something. I always feel like when I do my workshops that I feel like I stand on sacred ground with people. And let me explain that. I feel like when I get to stand in front of people in a room or on a Zoom meeting like today, I really feel like that it's sacred ground. In other words, I take this very seriously, and I take it with a lot of humility, that you guys are here, and in different ways you're kind of exposing you're kind of being vulnerable with your lives. You're asking questions that are diving into some of the most difficult areas of your life. And I want you to know that I respect that and I honor that, and I'm grateful to be with you in this journey. So I wanted to start off just telling you that. I also want to remind you that there's no judgment in what we're doing today. So those of you that have people in the home with you, please don't feel judged in any ways. One of my goals that I have in my life is I want to make our churches much more accepting of all sorts of people that have all sorts of issues. And the reason I do that is because Jesus was like that. When you read Jesus and you read his stories that are in the Bible, what you're going to find is that Jesus spent most of his time with people that were hurting. And Jesus, if there's anything that describes him, it's his heart. It's really interesting. I'm reading a book right now. It's called Gentle and Lowly. And basically the premise of this book is that Jesus, there's only one place that he ever mentions his own heart, where he describes his own heart. And it's in Matthew 11, verse 29, I believe it is, where he says, I am gentle and lowly in heart. Jesus has a heart that wants to be around the hurting people among us. He loved social justice. He loved the idea of correcting the inequities that are among us. In other words, Jesus looked around his world, and those that were not in power, those that were hurting, those who, those the minorities among him, those were the people that he had a special heart for. And those are the people that he identified with the most. So because of that, I've taken that on in my own life. So when I see social injustice among us, I'm thinking that's Jesus's area there. That's something we need to be all about. The Church of Christ needs to be all about social injustice. When I look around and I see mental health issues in members' lives that aren't going well, I think, hey, this is Jesus's area right here. This is what he specialized in. When I see sinners, I see people that have sin in their lives that's very difficult. That's where Jesus shines the greatest. He doesn't shine the greatest when we're doing perfect. Actually, Jesus came along for those of us that are struggling. And so I want to just remind you of that as we get started on the grief journey, is that there is no judgment for those of us that struggle with mental health, for those of us that struggle in sin. Listen, guys, I've been a Christian 40 years. I still struggle with sin. I want you to know that. And those of us that struggle with grief, as we get older, we are having more and more grief issues among us. It's just the way it is. We are beginning to lose our parents, and we're beginning to lose one another. And I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I can tell this isn't going to stop. In other words, as we get older, we are going to have more and more grief to deal with. And man, there is nothing greater than the Lord's church to deal with grief. So what I'm going to do now is spend some time talking to you about the grief journey. And I want to make sure the slide is it full screen slide right now, or Amari? Because what I'm seeing is
What do you see?
I just see I see the slide, but it's not like the full screen. So I want to make sure other
Okay,
people see
let me
it.
try to fix that.
Okay. And maybe it's just the way it's looking to me. So, but it looks like they're seeing some faces and maybe the chat and all that stuff. But maybe it is. So if it is for everybody else, then that's good.
Is that better?
Yeah, I mean, it looks the same, but if everybody else sees a full screen, then I'm good. Let's see here. It says share the program screen, not the computer. Yeah, I think some people still see the computer screen. So they see the slide, but they're still seeing your toolbar and stuff like that. And I think they still see maybe some faces and stuff. Okay, now somebody says I see a full screen. And other people say, no, we don't see full screen. So I'm going to let you deal with that, Amari, and I'm just going to keep going on, okay? So anyways, welcome to the grief journey. And what we're going to do today is spend some time talking about, we're going to talk about a little bit about personal grief, but we don't have enough time to really dive into this. Normally I do a couple hours on this thing. But what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about personal grief. And then we're also going to talk about how do we help each other in grief. In other words, in a church setting, we're around a lot of people that have grief in their life. So we're going to talk about how do we help each other and what do we do for ourselves. So not as much today on personal grief, but more on social grief, like how do we work with one another. But there's going to be some things that are going to be really helpful to everybody that's attending today. So it's called the grief journey. And if we can go to the next slide, please. I'm going to read you the introduction to my book. So if you'll give me just a minute to do this, I'm going to read you why I started this, why I wrote the book, and why I'm so interested in grief, okay? So here's the introduction in my book. It says here, in the fall of 2006, I received the most devastating phone call of my life. My mom had lung cancer. What? In my family? How could this be? She had never smoked a day in her life. and was always a picture of health. And we all expected her to live well into her 90s, maybe even 100. I was confused, overwhelmed, emotional, and distraught. The next few months were a blur of visits, prayers, tears, and then finally the call in the early morning hours on February the 20th, 2007, that she had peacefully passed away. I was shocked and speechless. My grief landscape crumbled. A few short years later, my father passed somewhat unexpectedly. One day he was at home on the phone, excitedly talking to me about his next trip with his newfound friend Betty. The next day he was in the hospital in a coma, facing death. I was able to rush to his bedside, pray with him, and tell him how much I loved him and to be near him. I stayed up all night by his bedside. The next day we brought him home from the hospital, and he died early in the morning in his home on January 1st, 2011. I felt lost, lonely, confused, and hurt. Again, prayers, shock, pain, and a flood of tears. You see, for many years as an adult, I believed that if my world fell apart around me, I could always go back to my parents' home and be okay. I would have a bed to sleep on and food to eat. And now that was no longer possible. A 50-year foundation was gone. My older brother, Craig, said at the funeral for my dad, "I feel like an orphan." Helen Keller said this about grief: "The only way to get to the other side is to go through the door." These events that I just shared with you started my personal grief journey, and it led me to write the Grief Journey book and to lead groups. So thank you for letting me share my story. That's a picture of my mom and dad. They were World War II vets, and then they were both buried in Quantico, Virginia, in the National Cemetery. There's a picture of it right there. So this book is dedicated to both uh, mom and dad, and I just wanted you to know where I came from on this. So next slide, please. So why do we do this? Why did 183 of you people log on a beautiful Saturday afternoon and decide to listen to me talk about grief? It seems like you got a lot better things to do with your lives, right? I mean, grief is hard. Why would anybody do this? Well, here's why we do grief. It's because if we deal with our grief, or our grief deals with us with hidden costs. In other words, guys, either we make a decision to engage our grief and work on it, or our grief will work on us. And I'll tell you, over the years, I've spent many years working with people in grief. Those people that have never engaged their grief is pushing them around. In other words, they can tend to be very angry, or very depressed, or very sullen. There's different things that grief will do to us if we don't engage it. So I tell people we've got to engage our grief, or it will engage us in negative ways. Now, let me say this as well, before I really get started here, is I know that today is going to trigger some of you guys. It's already triggered me. As I read my story, you probably heard me have to pause a few times just to get through that. My parents have been gone for about 10 years now, my mom for 13. Every time I do a grief journey workshop in front of churches, I read the introduction to my book, I cry. Almost every single time I cry. And because it triggers me. And in one way, guys, I'm glad I do that. I'm glad I still cry when I think about my mom and dad. And I never want I want there to always be a little bit of a sting with their passing. Because what it does, it reminds me of how important they were to me. So I want you to know that as I talk today, many of you are going to be triggered, and many of you may feel very sad, and it might be difficult, but that's okay. Again, there's no judgment here. In a way, I'm kind of glad that you're hitting some emotional pieces in your life, and that's not a bad thing. All it means is that you had great love in your life for these people that you've lost. Somebody once said, with great love comes great pain. And that if you don't have much pain, then maybe there wasn't a much love there either. So when you feel a lot of pain at a loss, it is an indication that there was great love there. So I want you to know that, okay? Um, in New York City, all of us get it. You guys have gone through the worst part of it for our nation. I don't think there's an area in the United States that has more pain and loss than New York has had. And I know that many of you have lost your own friends or family members. I know there's been church members who have passed because of it. Um, and there's all sorts of other losses that you're undergoing. You're undergoing a loss of a job, maybe, loss of control. You're seeing other people suffer. So, guys, this is going to be probably a very difficult time for you as we talk. But I want you to remember that God is working in your life to get you through these times. Okay. And I also want to let you know another thing. My grief groups, I do a lot of different groups, recovery groups for addictions and things like that. But my favorite group that I do is my grief group. And you might think, wow, Tim, that's really weird. Here's why grief is my favorite group to do, because the people in grief groups have been hit with the very most difficult thing in life. There's nothing more difficult than losing a loved one permanently. And yet these people are still standing and they're still working on something that's very difficult. And there is an authenticity and a genuineness to grief that I find very refreshing. I love to be around people that are working on their grief because I know that these people are honest, they're real, and I'm seeing the real person back there. So I want you to know that I'm honored to be with you guys today as we all work through this together. So next slide, please. So why do we do this? Another reason we do it is we're allowed to, when we engage our grief, we actually resolve grief issues. And the book that I wrote, it's called The Grief Journey. It's there to help you resolve the personal and the social issues that you might have with grief. Also, why do we do grief? Because it teaches us vulnerability. There's been nothing more in my life that's made me vulnerable than my losses I've experienced. Um, it's created vulnerability. And let me tell you guys something, vulnerability is honored by God. Matter of fact, I read this a while back. A guy made a point. He said, Jesus is the vulnerability of God. Thought about that, like, wow. When God wanted to demonstrate vulnerability, what he did is he sent his son into the world. Think about it. You talk about a vulnerable move. When God sent Jesus down to the earth, he knew like we were not going to treat him well. Jesus is the vulnerability of God. God's very vulnerable. Think about God being vulnerable. Wow. He exposed, he exposed himself to weakness in a sense by giving us Jesus. He knew that we were not going to treat him well. He knew that we would reject him, and yet he did it anyways. God honors vulnerability. God honors weakness, actually. Um, I don't want to get into all that because it's a whole nother sermon, but grief is our opportunity to develop vulnerability. And by the way, vulnerability is what attracts people to Jesus. It's really cool. Jesus once said this. He said, when I'm lifted up, all men will come to me. What did he mean? He said that when I'm at my very weakest moment on the cross, when I'm lifted up on the cross, all men will be drawn to me. Jesus made a point that vulnerability draws us to each other. When we're weak with each other, we're drawn to each other. Don't you find that to be true in your own life? That when you're weak, other people are drawn to you. I do that when I evangelize. I tell people my weaknesses. I tell people how my church helps me with my weaknesses. And they go, really? What kind of church is that? I used to tell people all the time, hey, come to my church. It's really strong. It's awesome. It's amazing, blah, blah, blah. And they're all like, no, I already got my own church to go to. But when I approach people and say, hey, listen, my church helps me with my weaknesses, they're always a lot more like, yeah, let me come. I want to know more about that. So it helps us with vulnerability. Also, grief, engaging grief helps us in relationships. And it helps us to resolve our old relationships. It helps us resolve relationship with those that we lost. It's really interesting that we can resolve issues with somebody who's already died. And it helps us to resolve relationships um, with current people. And then finally, in the grief journey, we become pioneers of compassion. In other words, as you know, those of us that have gone through grief and dealt with it and been around other people, we are much better at helping those people that are currently going through grief. So anyways, I just want to remind you guys of that our weaknesses in grief are just like Jesus. We're being just like him. And Paul even said it once perfectly. He said, listen, when I am weak, then I am strong. And he meant that. He wasn't just like saying really cute things. He meant it. When we're weak, we're really strong, because that's when God kicks in for us. Okay, next slide, please. So here's what I want you to do for just about 30 seconds. If you got somebody in your home, I want you to turn to them and share with them one way that having a loss in your life has affected you. So if you're by yourself, you just got to think about it. But if you're with somebody else, to share one way that your losses have affected you in your life. And we have 30 seconds of silence. Go for it. Okay, now I know that's not enough time to have a conversation. This is always bad when I do this publicly, because I'll get a group of like 400 people start talking, and then all of a sudden I get them say, okay, we're done after a minute, right? Because you just get started. But I think I do that little exercise just to simply remind us that all of us have been impacted by grief. Unless you're like 9 years old or something, um, if you're a teenager or above, chances are very good that you've been impacted by grief. Next slide, please. So the first thing I want to do is remind us that Jesus embraced his grief. You guys know the story in John chapter 11, right? Jesus had really close family friends. It was Lazarus and his two sisters, Martha and Mary. They were like really good family friends. They weren't just like disciples that were doing stuff. They were just great friends. There's this one place right after this where it talks about Jesus having dinner, and it says Lazarus was actually laying on his bosom, like he had his head kind of like nestled up in Jesus's chest. Okay, that's how close these guys were. They were just like great family friends. You think about it. You know people like that you guys are just, you do cookouts together. Maybe you watch TV, you play cards together. They're just those people that you could just be yourself with, right? Hopefully everybody has somebody that they're super close to. Well, that was Lazarus, Martha, and Mary for Jesus. They were like his people, right? His buddies. And at one point, somebody came up and said, hey, Jesus, Lazarus is getting ready to die. You need to go there right now. And what did Jesus do? He didn't go, like for 3 days, I think it was. He just hung out, and then he finally got there. And by the time he got there, Lazarus had died. So this is amazing, right? So Jesus, one thing he did is he engaged his loss. In other words, Jesus walked right in to the loss that people were experiencing. He could have stood on the sidelines and kind of watched everybody. He could have stood around and done a sermon or pontificated and maybe taught a bunch of things. But what happens is Jesus walked right in to his own grief. He engaged it. And there's one point where he was so overcome with grief, the Bible says Jesus wept. Now, Jesus, it's really interesting. It doesn't say Jesus cried. You know, when you're crying, you can control it, kind of wipe away the tears and pull yourself together, right? But that's not what Jesus did. He wept. Weeping is uncontrolled crying. And probably all of us at one time or another in our life have wept. I can think of a few times in my life right now where I wept, and it was uncontrolled crying. Nobody could get me to stop. I remember one time I wept over my sin, and I was on my face, on my hands and knees, on my carpet, and I cried so much about my sin that when I touched the carpet, it was kind of soggy with my tears. You see, that's what Jesus did. He was in front of these people, and he didn't do the whole thing like, oh, I need to be strong here, and I don't want people to see me being out of control. Jesus got out of control with his crying. He wept in front of people, okay? So he engaged his loss. You know, our society says, hey, men, don't cry. That's what our society tells us. But I tell the brothers that I meet with, hey, don't listen to society. Do what Jesus did. He let his emotions and his grief get to him. Now, here's what some people say, and I'm going to teach you something here. What some people say, they say, well, Jesus knew that he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, so it was okay for him. But you know what? That's not true. Because if you say that Jesus knew he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead, and so he was okay, the reason that's not true is because that would make Jesus like a hypocrite, or that would make him not authentic. That would mean like his crying was kind of like a show that he put on for people. It's not. Jesus authentically felt the loss of Lazarus. He engaged himself in the presence with people, and he allowed himself to feel what he was feeling. He engaged his loss. I'm so respectful of him that way, that he was willing to let himself feel whatever he was feeling. So also, Jesus understood bargaining. Jesus, you remember the time Martha came up to him and she was kind of mad at him a little bit, and she said, Jesus, if you had been here, maybe he wouldn't have died. That's called bargaining, and that's very normal. I want you to know that if you bargain with God after a death, it's very normal. After my mom died of lung cancer, we all got around, my 5 brothers and myself, and we started making comments like, well, we got the wrong diagnosis, the wrong doctor, because they didn't diagnose her cancer till later on. They misdiagnosed it. And so we were kind of doing this bargaining thing. I remember times with God, I was like, God, how could you have my mom get lung cancer and she's never smoked a cigarette a day in her life? Why did that happen? You see, bargaining is very normal. Jesus allowed Martha to bargain a little bit. It's very normal that we would do that. So if you've bargained before and you've been mad at God, that's okay. God expects it. It's part of dealing with our loss. Thirdly, Jesus leaned into his pain. In other words, like I said before, he didn't just walk away, he walked right into the middle of grief. And then the last thing before we move on, Jesus served in his grief. This is really important. Jesus served. I remember once a friend of mine um, taught me about serving in grief, but then I saw it in action when my mother was sick. I went to visit her, and she was pretty far along, and she had like the breathing tube thing in her nose. And then she got up to go to the bathroom one night, and all of us were sitting around watching TV, and she got up to go to the bathroom, and then she didn't make it to the bathroom. She soiled the floor before she got to the bathroom. And all of us in the room, my brothers and I, my dad, we froze, and nobody knew what to do. And I'll never forget, my brother Curtis stood up, and it was interesting. Curtis is kind of like maybe a bit of the black sheep of the family kind of guy. But he got up and he went over and he picked my mother up, and then he walked her in the bathroom and he cleaned her up, and then he came out and cleaned up the floor. And we were all like stunned. And I learned a valuable lesson that when we don't know what else to do in grief, we serve. We serve other people. So when you're around grief and you don't know what to do, just serve. Find something to do to help other people. Next slide, please. Okay, go ahead and hit one, please. Okay, in personal grief, here's some of the things. We're going to have mental issues, okay? People struggle mentally during grief. So you might find yourself more confused. Um, you might find your cognitions not quite firing all the way. In other words, what used to be easy to think about, you may find difficult. When you go back to work after a significant loss, you might find it difficult to engage the work process that you're doing. You might find yourself really distracted or just super unmotivated to engage mentally. So that's one. Go ahead and hit the next one. Physical, we have problems with physical issues. I know some people in grief, they sleep a whole lot, or other people sleep very little. In other words, their physical, their bodies start changing. Some people eat a lot in grief, and we gain weight. I know something I struggled with when I was grieving. And other people don't eat very much and they lose weight. Some people want to go work out and get really strong and fit, and other people quit doing things like that. They quit hiking or quit walking. So be aware that physical issues can happen in grief. Hit the next one, please. Emotional, that's a pretty easy one to figure out, right? Our emotions can be all over the map in grief, and that's okay. There's not one way to deal with grief. In other words, my emotions are not like the proper way. They were proper for me. And guys, remember that emotions are not sinful. In other words, there's no such thing as a sinful emotion. Emotions are simply like a barometer or a thermometer. They're there to tell us what's going on inside of our bodies. So your emotions are neutral. They don't have any value to them as far as morals or being sinful. Now, what you do with an emotion can be a very sinful thing. So for instance, if I'm really angry at somebody, that's not a sin. But if I turn around and punch that person, then that's a sin, right? So what we do with our emotions can be sinful. They can have value morally, but emotions by themselves are not sinful. So I want to remind you that in grief, you just need to feel whatever you're feeling. I remember one day about a month after my mom died, I had a regular day at work. I don't even think, I'm not even sure I thought about her much that day. And then I went to the rec center to work out. And I was sitting on this bench in the locker room, tying my tennis shoe, and I just started bawling. I just started crying right there and then. And like these people are looking at me like, "Are you okay, buddy?" Um, and I don't even know where that came from. I hadn't been thinking about her at all. So be aware that your emotions can be all over the map, and that's pretty normal, okay? Next one, please. Spiritually, yeah, grief can impact us spiritually. I know people that in grief, they get really close to God. That was something that helped me. Was in my grief, I got really connected to God in some new ways. Um, but other people don't. They get distant from God. They get in these weird places with God, and they might distrust him or begin to question him in ways that are really unhealthy. So be aware that spirituality can be really impacted in our grief. Those of you that are friends with people that have grief going on, be aware of that. Be aware that their spiritual lives may suffer, and be there very patiently to help them. Some people will quit coming to church. Um, excuse me, some people quit coming to church. Other people get really clingy at church, and they want to be there all the time, kind of thing. It just impacts us in different ways. Some people quit having quiet times for a while. Just be aware that it can impact our spiritual lives. And then next one, please. I believe it's socially. Yes, socially, we get impacted by grief. You know, some people, like I said, get really clingy to other people, and they feel like they want to be around people all the time. On the other hand, for myself, I didn't want to be around people that much. Like, I remember I got her diagnosis on a night. The diagnosis that my mom's cancer was terminal. I got it on the day of a midweek, and I didn't go to midweek that night. I just didn't want to be around people. I felt the need to be with my God that night, and I just didn't go to church, and that was okay. Nobody called me on it. Nobody got mad at me. They understood that in my grief, being around people would have been a very negative thing. I needed to be alone with my God that night. So remember that socially speaking, your grief can push you around a little bit. So go ahead and go to the next one, please. Also remember that in our grief, we're all unique individuals. In other words, people do grief differently. Now, there are like commonalities to grief, and I just got through sharing some of those. There are some things that kind of all of us go through, like bargaining. But actually, grief, for the most part, is a very individual journey, and it's dependent upon the person that we lost. So our grief is very individual. That's why we can't tell people some of the things we're going to go through in a minute, because we all deal with grief in a unique way. So do you remember when you were a little kid and maybe you found out that your great uncle Joe died, and he was a guy that you'd never met before, you weren't even sure who he was, and it didn't really affect you much, right? Like you didn't know the guy, and it just didn't make much difference, so you didn't have much grief to deal with. But then when you lose a parent, or you lose a best friend or a sibling, that's different, right? Because of the relationship you have with that person. So our unique journey of grief is dependent upon the different kinds of relationships that we suffer the loss of. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now go ahead and hit the first one. Boy, I'm still not seeing, I can't even read the whole slide, but so what I want to do is spend 2 slides, and I want to talk about the myths or the things that we say to people that we shouldn't be saying, right? So these are the different things that we might be saying to people. And I don't know about you guys, but I've probably done all of these at one time or another. So these are the wrong things that we say, okay? So we reach out, friends, family, and grief. Here's something that we might say. We might say nothing. Have you ever done that before, where you just don't say anything? You're like, you know, a friend of yours dies, and you go back to work, or your mom or dad dies, and then you go back to work a week later and nobody says anything about it, right? We do that. Maybe we don't know what to say. You know, we have a friend that's gone through grief and we don't know what to say. We're afraid, like, if I say something, I'm going to make it worse. And so we say nothing. Guys, please don't do that. Don't say nothing. Always say something to people. You can always say something like, I'm just so sorry that you've gone through this loss, and leave it at that. You can always let people know, like, at least, you know, I'm here with you, but don't say nothing. When we do the nothing thing, then it can be really damaging for people. Here's another one. We'll say this. We'll say, you were lucky, ... Like, I remember one guy said, hey, how old was your mom when she died? And I said, she was 82 years old. And he basically said, well, you were lucky you had her for so many years. Now, guys, that's true, okay? Um, that's a true statement that I was lucky to have my mom that many years. But you know what? I could have had her for 100 years. And then when she dies, it would still be a great loss for me. It doesn't matter how long I had her. When I lost her, it was a great loss. So sometimes we try to make we try to make people feel better by saying you were lucky you had them all these years. That doesn't help anybody at all, and it's kind of offensive to me actually when people say that you were lucky to have them all these years. There's no amount of time that we have with people that make it like, okay, we've had them enough time, now I'm ready for them to die. It's just not true. So you were lucky. Can you? I can't see my slide, by the way, so I'm kind of flying solo here. Um, uh, uh, oh, there it is. Okay, good, good. Thank you. So the third one says, you should be over this by now. That's a really bad one. When you say to people, you should be over your grief by now, what you're really saying is that there's a set time limit for how we should grieve. So that's just not true. Some people take a little bit of time to grieve and then they're okay. Other people take a long time, and it's dependent about a lot of different circumstances around the death. You know, it just depends. So we should never tell people like you should be over this by now. Um, if you're concerned with somebody, let's say you've got a friend or a family member and their grief has gone on for a long time and you're concerned and maybe it's not getting better, then what you should do is say, hey, how can I help you? You should ask questions like, what's it been like for you? Tell me more about your mom. What do you miss the most about your mom? What's been the hardest part of your loss? If you're concerned that somebody's been going on for a long time, then start asking questions, but don't say, well, hey, you should be over this by now. Go ahead and hit the next one, please. Don't feel bad. I hear that one too. Don't feel bad. Or they'll say things like, your loved one wouldn't want you to cry. And usually we say that because we're starting to feel bad and we don't want to be around people that are feeling bad. So please stay away from don't feel bad. Um, so, um, so those are all things that we say. And the Bible says this, like one who takes away a garment on a cold day, or like vinegar poured on a wound, is one who sings songs to a heavy heart. What that proverb says is that when you try to sing songs to a heavy heart and you try to make people feel better, it's actually doing the opposite. So that's one thing we don't want to try to do. We don't want to try to fix people's grief. What you do when you do that, you make it worse. It's like taking away a garment on a cold day. Like guys walking outside, and he's got a big old overcoat on. It's one of those New York winters where it's like 20 below zero, and you take the guy's garment off of him. It makes him feel worse. It doesn't make him feel better. So be careful when you try to sing songs to a heavy heart. Think in terms of comforting people by simply walking with them. I tell my clients, they come to me for grief sometimes, and they think I can fix their grief. And one of the first things I tell them, I'll say, I'm sorry, but I cannot fix your grief. I tell them, I will walk with you in your grief. I will be with you here in your grief, but I cannot fix it for you. I can simply walk with you, listen to you, and ask questions. Okay, next slide, please. Here's some other ones. I know how you feel. Actually, you don't know how I feel. Sometimes people, they have this need to relate to me, and they'll say things, I know how you feel, but I'll tell them like, you know what? You really don't, because it wasn't your mom. So I appreciate you trying to connect to me in that way, but it doesn't really help to say, I know how you feel. Here's another one. They'll say, time heals all wounds. And you know what? That's false. Time does not heal all wounds. and I've seen it over and over and over again. Time does not heal all wounds. I know people who have had grief for 20 and 30 years, and they've never done anything about it, and they're still as angry today as they were the day they lost their loved one. Time by itself does not heal wounds. Time with a grief process will heal wounds. In other words, if you take time and you interject a process of grief healing into it, then you can heal your wounds. So that's why we have grief groups in the church that I'm a part of, because we feel like if we'll take people and during the time that they're grieving, if we help them with a process, then it will heal those wounds that they have. But time by itself does not heal wounds. Okay? So that's why I wrote a book, and that's why I want people to get this book or to have grief groups in their church so they can have a process of grief during that time. And that's what heals wounds. It's time plus a process. Here's another one. People will say, well, that reminds me. I actually had somebody say, that reminds me of the day my dog died. I thought, oh, great. I'm really glad that the loss of my mother reminds you of the day your dog died. Now, I know losing a dog is important, but sometimes we try to relate to people by saying things like, well, it just reminds me of this or that. That doesn't usually help people, because what you've done is when you say that reminds me of something, you've brought the conversation into yourself. We call that hijacking a conversation, and we do it all the time, right? We say something to relate to somebody else, and what we've done, we've stolen the conversation for ourselves, and we've taken the spotlight off the person who's hurting the most. So we don't want to do that. We don't want to do it in grief, and we don't want to do it even in other situations where we steal the conversation. Americans are really bad at that. So don't do that reminds me of. Remember to keep the conversation focused on the person who's hurting. And then finally, the last myth I want to share with you is the myth of being a theologian. And here's what I mean by that. Sometimes when we try to help people with their grief, we play theologian. So we'll say things like, well, they're in a better place. Or we'll say something like, wow, now they're in heaven. Or I've even heard people say like, wow, that person's not in heaven anymore, or never, that person didn't go to heaven. And people will judge and play theologian with a lost loved one. So we tell people in our groups, like, listen, don't be a theologian in our groups. It's okay to go get advice or talk to a theologian outside the group if you want, but this is not the place to play theologian. In other words, simply by saying, wow, they're in a better place, I'm glad for those who die in the Lord, that they are with the Lord. I'm really glad for that. And I'm grateful for having lost friends, knowing that they're with the Lord. But that's not my goal in grief. My goal in grief is to resolve my grief issues. And even worse, though, I've had people say things like, well, what's it like knowing that your mom's in hell now, or something like that? And that's a horrible thing to put on somebody else. So we ask people to not play theologian. Let's let God deal with that part of our creation, okay? Let's let him have the last word on people's theological issues, okay? So we don't do that in our grief groups. We kind of stay away from that. Romans 12 verse 15 says, we mourn with those who mourn. Our goal, guys, with one another is simply to mourn with people that mourn. It's okay to be with somebody and just be quiet, or to be with them and to simply listen to them. So as I close out today, I've got a couple thoughts for you. Next slide, please. I've got two slides that I want to work with you on here. And these are going to be slides that will help you understand how can we help each other. And this is for the griever also. This is for the person to figure out what they need in grief. So I love the story about the man who was an invalid, and he had 4 friends take him up on the roof when Jesus was leading a Bible talk downstairs, right? So you guys know the story. This is really good. This guy was an invalid, and the Bible says at the beginning of the story, it says some men came. In other words, more than 4 guys came. He had a bunch of guys that came to him, and then it says 4 of them took him up on the roof. So here's a man who, for some reason, he engendered loyalty to himself. There's something about this man. I don't know what it was. The Bible doesn't tell us, but there's something about this guy that people wanted to be around him and they wanted to help him. So 4 of the guys said, hey, let's get together and let's help this man out. Let's get him to Jesus. Maybe they tried to bang in the door, and the room was so packed they couldn't even get inside the door. Like people were slamming the door in their face. So one guy goes, I tell you what, let's get him up on the roof. So they get up on the roof, and he had 4 friends, and I think they all had different roles to play, right? Like one guy had to figure out where was Jesus in the room. One guy had to be the engineer and figure out how to take the roof apart. And the one guy had to get the pulley system going to lower the man down there. So they lower this man down. And then the Bible is really cool. The Bible says, because of all of their faith. So Jesus looked at the whole 5 of them, and he says, because of all of your faith, I'm going to heal you. And Jesus, like always, he's so amazing. You know, he was having this Bible talk, and then he totally shifted gears. Like he's on one subject, and then all of a sudden this roof thing happens, and they lower this man, and Jesus shifted gears. He heals the man, and he teaches something different. So this guy had 4 friends, very important people. And I think in grief, we need to have 4 friends as well. So these are the 4 kinds of people that we need in grief. Number 1, you need to have a relator. You do need to have somebody in grief that has been there before you. In other words, you need somebody that's walked down the grief journey before you have, and they understand some of the commonalities of grief. Let me tell you a quick story. After my mom died, about a month later, after the funeral, on one Sunday morning, I had this amazing dream about my mom. Have you ever had a dream where you were like it felt like you were right there in the dream? It was a real dream, and you could smell and feel the people in the dream. I had one of those, and it was just so intense. And you know, in the dream, my mom walked up to me, and she looked really good. And I said, Mom, how are you doing? And she says, I'm okay. And then we had this hug. And then she did this really funny thing that she used to always do when I got emotional. She would always try to sweep away my emotions with her hands. And I remember her doing that in the dream. And then she just walked away. And I woke up. It was early Sunday morning. And I woke up and I sat on the edge of my bed like, oh my gosh, what just happened? I could almost like, it was almost like it was still going on. And I remember sitting there, and for a minute I thought, oh, it's Sunday morning. I got to get ready for church. I'm going to have a busy day today. So I almost got up out of bed and just started getting ready for church. But then I thought, no, I can't do that. I would dishonor my mom by just getting busy all of a sudden. So I sat there and I wept for 20 minutes. I just engaged that dream for everything it was. After I wept, I went downstairs and I wrote the dream into my Google Calendar, and I hit the annual reminder button after I wrote it all out, because I wanted to every year on that day it comes up in my Google Calendar, and I look through my notes of the dream because it was so real. But the downside to it, guys, was I felt like the day my mom died. Okay, I felt very raw. I went to church and it was really hard. I cried. I felt very much out of sorts. And then I came home that day and I thought, I can't live like this. I was kind of getting distraught. Like I thought, is my life always going to feel this raw? So what did I do? I called my best friend, Mark Young, up. Mark knew grief. He had lost his 4-year-old son to a swimming pool accident years ago. And Mark knew grief. He understood grief. So I called him up. I said, Mark, and I told him what happened. And I said, am I always going to feel this way? And he just smiled on the phone. He said, no, Tim, you're going to do okay. He said, after about a year, it gets better and better, okay? But you got to kind of wait through that first year. So we need a relator, okay? We need somebody that's kind of been there, done it, that we can get advice from, okay? So we need the relator. Secondly, though, we need a friend. We need somebody who does not do grief with us. In other words, we need a person that will live normal life with us. Sometimes we get so wrapped up in our grief that we forget that there's a world around us that's regular and normal. So one of the things I suggest is finding somebody who will simply be a friend and go out and just do normal stuff with you. We find that at school, the school that I work in. Sometimes I have students who are going through grief, and what I notice is that when they come to school, for them, school is like the normal place to be. Like they have homework to do, they have regularity there, like the bells ring at the same time, and they have for their friends around, and they don't have to do grief during school because when they go home, it's nothing but grief. So they tell me things like, Mr. Sumerlin, I just want to come to school and I just want to be here and be a regular kid. And so I realize that we do need friends in grief that are simply going to do life with us normally. Like, hey, you want to go watch a movie? You want to go catch a Rangers game or whatever, you know? They're just going to do normal stuff with us. Number three, you need a listener with you. You've got to have somebody who's going to sit and listen. And what I tell people, guys, is I say, I'll tell people like, listen, I'm having a hard day. Would you listen for me? I have to ask permission because most of us are not good listeners. So I'll just say, can I talk for about 20 minutes? And I'm just going to tell you about my mom a little bit. I'm having a hard day. So we need somebody that will just stop and listen to us. And then finally, the fourth friend, I call him the truth teller. Sometimes, guys, in our grief, we get sideways, okay? And we might get sinful, or we might get off track or just get wonky in our walk with God. And what we need sometimes, we need a gentle truth teller. We need somebody in our life that will sit down and say, hey, Tim, I've noticed this about you lately. How can I help you? Maybe they're going to open the scriptures with me and gently walk me back onto the road or back onto the path. We need to make sure that we still have people around us that are truth tellers. They're people that with compassion and with heart can kind of help us get back on track when we need it. So those are the four friends that we need in grief. Next slide, please. This is my final slide. And this is where I'm going to really remind you guys how, as a church, we help a grieving friend. Okay, so so this stuff's super important, and then we'll be done for the day. So number one, timing's really important. So you know when somebody dies, that next week we support the heck out of them. Like when somebody dies, everybody cooks food. I've seen people have to turn away food, like they're like, I got no more room in the freezer for your food. Thank you. They get so much food, man, it's crazy, which is really good, right? And then we'll get cards. Like I remember after mom died, I got like 30 cards in the next couple of days in the mail. I was getting cards from people I forgot I was friends with who'd heard about it. So there's a lot of support right after somebody dies. The funeral happens, people fly in from out of town, all the relatives are there. It can actually be a very supportive environment. But what happens is 3 weeks later, everybody's gone home, the food stops coming, the cards stop coming. Many of our friends have actually forgot that we lost somebody. We wake up in the morning and we realize I'll never see that person again. I remember it was right at 3 weeks after mom died. I woke up and I thought I will never see my mom again. And I was hurting, but all the support was gone. So here's what I do is if I'm not the main person involved, I hold back for a couple of weeks. I don't bring food right away and I don't send a card right away. I wait for about 3 weeks and then I send a card, and then I initiate with some food. Because that's when all the support has kind of dried up. And that's when they can really use some extra support. So think about the timing, okay? If you can, don't jump in when everybody else is jumping in. See if you can time your support throughout the first couple weeks. Secondly, make sure that you have a safe and confidential environment to talk to your friend with. Here's what you don't want to do. You don't want to do what I call drive-by fellowships. Here's drive-by fellowship. You know, the preacher preaches, the last song's done, it's time for fellowship. And what happens? You walk up to your friend who just lost his mom and you say, hey, how are you doing? And there's like people standing all over the place. That's not a safe and confidential place to talk about losing your mom. You don't want to do that because then somebody else comes away, hey, you want to go get lunch today? Or, hey, how about them Jets, you know, or whatever. How about them Yankees, that kind of thing. And then all of a sudden you've lost your friend who you just asked a really important question for. So when you talk to people about their grief, make sure that you do it in a safe and confidential place, somewhere that they can open up and they can cry if they need to, or they can be angry if they need to, or they can spend a few minutes really talking. So if you're in the fellowship, at least take the person to the back of the auditorium, or go to backstage area, or go to one of the kids' kingdom rooms that's cleared out and spend time with them. Better yet, in fellowship, say, hey, I've been thinking a lot about you. Can I buy you a cup of coffee this week on Wednesday night? And give them space to really sit down and talk through their loss, okay? So a safe and confidential environment is essential. And that means also that you never tell other people what you talk about, okay? That's not confidentiality. You're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to get with somebody, hear their grief, and then tell somebody else about it. It's not right. You can never do that unless that grieving person gives you permission. And by the way, that's the same with in our recovery ministry, Disciples in Motion, is we provide what's called a safe and confidential environment where people are allowed to say what they want to say and nobody's allowed to tell anybody else, okay? It's a big deal. Number 3, listen and learn. So this one's super important as well because we don't know what other people's grief is like. So our job is to listen, ask questions, and then learn what it's been like for them. So I took a friend out about 2 or 3 months ago. His dad died, and I took him out for a beer and dinner. And I said, "Listen, Brett, I'm gonna buy you a beer. I'm gonna buy you dinner, and I just want you to tell me about your dad." And we spent 2.5 hours at this Irish pub, and I just listened for 2 hours about his dad. And it was so helpful to him later on. He goes, "Tim, that was so useful." And I was like, yeah, me too, man. I just learned so much about your dad and I learned a lot about you. I mean, it really bonded our friendship. And it's a real way of serving people in grief is to take them somewhere where there's a lot of time and you just listen and learn. Okay. Now, number 4, maybe it's going to be the most important thing I share today, and that's why I've got it in red. I call this holding the moment, okay? And I'm going to tell you a story or two here about holding what I mean by holding the moment. What I mean is we're talking here about holding an emotional moment, okay? It means holding on to emotions and not letting our emotions dictate what we're going to do to love each other. So here's what happened to me after my mom died. It was really hard, and I had a hard time, especially on Mother's Day at church. So I don't know about you guys in New York, but in Denver, what we do is, on Mother's Day, you walk in, and in Denver, we always got this group of the Black brothers who sing this song called Mama Song, and it's super emotional, and they do it almost every year on Mother's Day. And then the little girls get up in the service and they hand out flowers to all the moms, right? So every year, guys, I would go in there, and when we did the mama song and the flower thing, I would get up and leave. And I'd go hang out in the auditorium or in the foyer for like 20 minutes because I just couldn't handle my emotions. It was too much for me. I didn't want to sit there and cry in front of everybody. So I just got up and left. And that means that I was not holding my own emotional moment. In other words, somehow I was like denying my emotions and I was escaping them. So one year, a couple years ago, I went to church on Mother's Day. My wife was out of town. So I walked in, and sure enough, the brothers were up there rehearsing the Mama song. I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to kill me today. But for some reason, the Holy Spirit spoke to me. He just said, Tim, stay in here today. Just learn to hold your moment. So I sat down next to my friend Greg Jackson, and I think I even told my brother, I'm going to stay in here today, and I'm just going to sit it out. So sure enough, they sang the Mama song, and sure enough, I sat there and I cried. And then the little girls came by with the flowers, and they passed them down the aisle, and I sat there and watched the flowers go in front of me, and I cried again. And I learned that day that it's okay to hold on to my emotional moment and simply let my emotions be what they're going to be and not try to get rid of them. And I just thought, that's what Jesus did. He just simply let his emotions be. Well, here's what happened to this, guys. It translated into a very helpful moment with somebody else. About a year after, no, not even a year, about 8 months after that happened to me, dear friends of mine in our church, and they've allowed me to share this publicly, their son committed suicide. Rachel and Walter Thompson lost their 19-year-old son to suicide. His name was Nick. And these are people that have been Christians for like 38 years now. They're pillars in the Denver church. And their son killed himself, and it was horrible. You can imagine, as you can imagine. And so we had the funeral, and then a couple weeks after the funeral, the Thompsons Bible Talk leader called me and they said, Tim, we don't know what to do in our Bible Talk anymore. We don't know if we should talk about this more or should we just move on? So help us out. So I came into their Bible Talk one night and I did a grief Bible Talk. And Rachel and Walter were there. And I didn't think they were coming to it, but they were there. So I did this Bible Talk on grief. And after the Bible Talk, Rachel came up to me, and we're pretty good friends. And she was obviously crying. And she started sharing with me in her tears. She said, Tim, I need for Nick to come home. Nick needs to come back. I need him back at home. And she was telling me this through her tears. And guys, I didn't know what to do because I was getting very emotional myself. And I wanted her to stop. Like it was very difficult. And so my temptation was to tell her what? My temptation was to say, Rachel, Nick's not going to come back. Okay. That was what I was tempted to say. And thankfully, I had learned to hold on to my own emotional moment. So what I did, I held on to Rachel's emotional moment and I simply sat and listened to her for a while. You can imagine what would have happened if I had said, Rachel, he's not coming back. And that was I guess it was like an intellectually true statement, right? He wasn't going to come back. But I didn't tell her that. I simply held on to her emotional moment and I cried with her. And something very interesting happened after about 10 minutes or so. She began to morph into more rational thought. She began to say things like, Tim, I just miss my son. And she began to kind of move into more useful or more effective thinking that was rational. And I learned a great lesson that day. I learned that if I would hold on to my emotional moments, then I can hold on to other people's emotional moments and I can really help them out. And we've seen this in our grief groups over and over again. When people get very emotional in grief, we don't try to stop their emotions. We don't pat them on the back and we don't rub their backs and we don't tell them it's going to be okay. What we do is simply allow them to grieve the way God's designed them to grieve. And that's through their tears and their emotions. So in our grief groups, You're not allowed to touch people when they're grieving. You're not allowed to like rub their backs or pat their knees or pat them on the shoulder. You're not allowed to say anything to them. You simply let them grieve. And that's the way God designed us. It's pretty interesting that he even designed us with tears. I mean, think about it. That's water that's washing our soul when we cry. That's what it is. Tears are like God's way of washing us. So we allow people to simply grieve, and we allow them to embrace their emotions. And what happens is when people are done embracing their emotions, they feel better. Isn't that true for you? Like when you cry and you're allowed to get it all out, then you feel good. You're like, oh, that's really healing. So when we touch people, we're kind of like stopping that process. And so I tell people later on, give them a hug, right? When we're all done, of course, go up and give them a hug, tell them how much you love them, um, touch them on their back, pat their leg if you want, or whatever you do, but not when they're grieving. Let them have their moment and just let it be what it's going to be. They're going to be okay. So that's called holding the moment. And then faithful questions simply means asking questions that move people along in the conversation. So ask them open-ended questions, things like, tell me about your mom. How did your mom make you laugh? What was it you missed the most about your mom? What do you miss the least about your mom? That's a good question sometimes. You know, all of us have things that we didn't like about those loved ones. So what do you miss least about them, right? Um, what was the most impactful thing your mom ever did for you? Things like that. Those are called faithful questions that get me talking about my mom, and they help me work through my grief. Here's another one, guys. Love and act. So here's a thing that we do sometimes. We'll be at a funeral, and then after the funeral, we walk up to the person who's our friend who lost their loved one, and here's what we do. We say, and you could probably say this along with me. You'll say, "If I can do anything, let me know." Right? We usually say that out of a good heart. We really do want to do something, but we'll say, "If I can help you in any way, please let me know." And here's the thing, nothing ever happens. Almost nobody ever calls you and says, "Hey, I need this to be done." It just doesn't happen. I've noticed over my lifetime that very few people will call me and take me up on my offer. So what I decided was to do something different is instead of asking people, I tell people. So here's how it might be different. Let's say there's a woman who um, who just lost her husband or something, and she has 3 kids. So what I'll do, I'll walk up, I'll say, "Hey, sister, I'm just so sorry to hear about this, and man, I'm with you on this. I just want you to know I'm praying for you." And then what I'll do is I'll say this. I'll say, "I know you got 3 little kids. Here's what I want to do on Wednesday night at 5 o'clock. I'm going to come by your house. I'm going to grab your kids and take them to McDonald's, and I'll buy them dinner, and then we'll do that McDonald's playground thing for like 2 hours. And so you can get 3 hours all by yourself. Will that work for you?" And usually they'll go, "You bet, go for it." And I'd come by the house, get the kids, take it to McDonald's or whatever, and then she gets 3 hours all by herself to go do laundry or whatever she wants to go do, right? That's called loving and acting. Find out what the needs are first, and then go tell the person how you're going to do it. Now they might say, "Oh, Wednesday night's not a good night. How about Friday night?" That's good. We'll do Friday night. Or you walk by that brother and say, "Hey, brother, I'm just so sorry about what's going on. I drove by your house yesterday. I noticed the lawn's a little bit, the grass is kind of tall. I'm going to come by Saturday and mow it for you, okay? You don't have to do anything. I'll just be by Saturday, and I'll take care of your lawn for you." That's how you love people in grief, is you tell them, "Here's how I'm going to love you." And then you go ahead and do it. Sometimes you got to go a couple different times to make it work out, but that's called loving people. And then finally, guys, I want to close out with this thought, is that helping people in grief is hard work. It's easier to ignore it It's easier to try to make it go away. We, as helpers, we have to have a hopeful heart. In other words, you have got to have your A game on to help those in grief, because it is not easy work. It takes sweat and blood and tears and faith to help those that are grieving. So please, please, please make sure that you're the kind of person that's ready to do this before you jump in, okay? So have a hopeful heart. God loves the griever. God has great compassion on the griever, and God wants to help them. So next slide, please. So I've got some time now for questions on grief, and I want you to know that in my if you signed up for my blog, you're going to get other information about grief in some of the weekly things we do. So, and then I've also got a book called The Grief Journey, Finding Peace in All of Life's Losses. It's sold at the IPI bookstore, which is the kind of like the ICOC publication thing. So if you don't know about it, you can always ask a friend or something. But it's a book that can help people through grief. It can help an individual. People can use it in small groups as well. It's designed for actually small groups. And if you're interested in your church, if you have an interest in, man, I want to lead these small groups, shoot me an email. I do training on the phone or on the Zoom. Again, I don't charge for it, but I do training for grief group leadership. It's not really hard to do, but I really have a passion to see churches do this stuff. So shoot me an email if you're interested. You can always go to my website, inmotioncounseling.org, and my email's on there as well. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to James or Ryan and see about some questions that you guys have. But thank you again for sitting and listening with me on the grief journey. And I just, my prayers are for all you guys that are struggling with grief. I want you to know I'm very grateful to be with you. So let's have some questions, and then we'll be done for the afternoon.
Amen. Tim, I just want to just say on behalf of all those who are here in the New York church, we're just grateful for you taking the time out to really help us. I know obviously if you have more time and just your heart and willingness to make yourself available to us, just really grateful for that. I know a lot of us here who has suffered some loss recently, and especially now where you're not able to go and grieve with the person, or you're not even allowed to bury your loved one. It's especially hard. So we thank you for this very helpful time. I know I've got a lot out of it. We've talked offline about some things, and I'm just really grateful for what you do, and pretty sure that we will be hearing from you in the future. So we're looking forward to that. I'm pretty sure, I know Maudie had some questions from before, but
yeah,
I think anyone that
yeah, okay, let's go ahead and get those answers up here. So my email address, will just say there, it says, what books or articles do you recommend to speak and explain about anxiety and grief to children? Wow, that's a very difficult question. So a couple thoughts. So you want to be honest with kids, and you want to be honest at the level that they understand. In other words, you want to use words that they understand that you're talking about. So you always want to create the conversation in a way that's age appropriate. So with grief, you never want to do things like, oh, they've gone to walk with Jesus now, and you don't want to use euphemisms that are confusing to kids. So you do need to use words that are very clear, like they've died and they're not going to come home. You don't want to say, well, they've just gone away for a little while, kind of thing, because what that does, it confuses kids, and then it also kind of it makes you kind of like they're wondering later on, why did she tell me that? If he's dead, he's dead. So I think the biggest thing is age appropriateness. And then there's just so many books, guys. What I do with books is I just get on Amazon and I put in the word Christian anxiety children. Put that in the search bar, and you'll get tons of good resources. The internet is just like obviously amazing at this stuff. So again, I get on Google and I just Google the words children anxiety or children grief and Christianity maybe. And then I just see tons of resources pop up. And then my job is to search through those resources and see which ones seem appropriate for my situation. So good question there. How about the next one? I've recently taken in a sibling who's bipolar. How can I be supporting to her? I'm very cautious when we speak and I'm scared I might say the wrong stuff. So actually, I'm going to answer this briefly because it's pretty complex. And I want to see if we can keep the some of the questions right now centered on grief if we can, because that's the one we just had a workshop on. But so bipolar, the big thing with bipolar, a couple of thoughts is make sure they're getting medical attention. There's some medicines that can be pretty helpful. With bipolar, they go way up and way down. So structure is very important with bipolar people. It's really important that they have a schedule and that they stay on schedule. So it says, I'm very cautious when we speak. I'm scared I might say the wrong stuff. That's really true, and I can understand it's kind of like walking on eggshells sometimes. That's why you've got to educate yourself a lot, and you've got to make sure they're getting as many resources as possible. You don't want to do this stuff on your own. You want to make sure there's medical people involved, that there's a counselor involved. If they're in a school, their school counselor can be a great resource. So again, think of resources here. Think of getting as many resources as possible. Next question, please. If someone's being impacted by COVID and is suffering with anxieties due to it, it states they want to study the Bible and get baptized, should we? Let me think. Yes, 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 and yes. Is there a protocol? How can we help them love God with all their being, including mine, under these circumstances? Guys, let me just say this. I get this question a lot. We don't become Christians and get saved because somehow we get our act together. When we become Christians, sometimes we think we got to be disciples in the way of being perfect, and that's not true. Listen, when we become Christians, we get baptized because we're a mess. And so sometimes we have this thing in our churches about, we expect people to become like perfect repentance and then become Christians. And that's just that's false theology there, guys. The whole point of becoming a Christian is that you're lost. And sometimes we baptize people and we talk about how great their hearts are, and we do all these accolades for people, and it really bothers me because two things. Number one, it's not true. When we become Christians, we're a mess. And number two, we put a lot of pressure on people. And somehow that once they get baptized, they have to be perfect. So guys, when you're studying the Bible with people, go for the heart. And the heart is, I see my need. I know my sin. Jesus came along to save me from the sin. I'm ready to go. That's the storyline I'm looking for when I baptize people. I'm not looking for them to be perfectly ready to go, like change the whole world in front of them. I want them to have a humble spirit. They're needy. They see their need for God, and they understand that they are now underneath God's care. Somebody once said, baptism changes a heart, but discipling changes character. So when I'm studying the Bible with somebody, I'm thinking that conversion is what their heart changes. That's their heart change. But it doesn't necessarily change all their character. Discipling does that. I've been a Christian 40 years. I've got major character to go through and get changed. That's what discipling does. My baptism simply changed my heart and got me on the right track, but it's the discipling later that does my character. So hopefully that helps you out. Please baptize that person. Go for it. Tim, do you have an ebook on your grief journey workbook? I do. It can be, you can go to IPI to get a Kindle or an ebook version. The one side I'll tell you about that is my book is actually also a workbook. So when you buy the physical copy, you can actually journal in the book. If you buy an e-copy, just make sure you have a journaling book next to that, so that because you've got assignments to write out in the grief journey book. But again, it's at ipibooks.com, I believe. Next question. If you're grieving, how do you know when you need to seek professional help? Good question. So here's the thing, guys. There's a diagnosis called complex grief or complicated grief. And what that is if you already have something going on, like anxiety or depression or bipolar, and then grief comes along, it can get tangled up together with each other. And that's called complex grief. And what that means is kind of like you don't get to grieve normally because your previous diagnosis is all tangled up with your grief. And that's where you need professional help. Is when your grief is at a point where it's interrupting your life so much that you can't function normally anymore. You can't function the way a normal grieving person grieves. So when does that exactly happen? It's hard to say, but I would say when people have reached depths of depression where they're not able to get up and go to work, or they're not able to attend to family matters, then those are the times when they need to go get some professional help. And a professional can kind of untangle their depression or anxiety from their grief in a way that they can do both of them in a more healthy way. How do you motivate yourself when you're grieving? If you know you should sleep earlier, or if you know you should check in with people, but you just refuse to do it. Well, interesting question, guys. That's a hard one because that does happen. Here's what I say is, one, Jesus did it. And I'm a disciple of his. So if he engaged his grief, then that's what I'm going to do. If he was such that he walked in and he did the healthy things he needed to do to work through his grief so that he could love other people, then that's what I want to do. So if Jesus did it, then I want to do it. The other thing is I want my life to count for other people. I want to be able to help people. And if I'm not going to engage the process of grieving, then what I'm doing is I'm kind of cutting myself out of the game. I'm kind of putting myself on the sideline. Now, listen, let me tell you this, guys. In your grief, you also have to be good to yourself. We tell people in the grief group, listen, please take care of yourself. Okay, it's essential because grieving does take a lot of energy. It takes a lot of emotional and physical energy to grieve. So we will tell people, please be good to yourself. Don't be Mr. Tough Guy, like I got to tough this thing out. Be nice to yourself in your grief. Treat yourself well. Give yourself rest, because that is what you're going to need to go through the grief process. If you don't do that for yourself, then it's going to kick you around for a while. So I hope that helps. Talk about how do you know you're at a place when you've lost someone that you have overcome grief? How do you know you've overcome grief? In one sense, guys, you never overcome grief. An hour ago, I was reading you the introduction to my book about my mom and dad, and I cried. My emotions got up there. And in that sense, I'll never overcome grief, and I never want to in that way. Until the day I die, I want to, in some ways, still feel the loss of my mom and dad. I want that for myself. I never want to act like nothing happened to me. Because that's not who they were. They were my mom and dad. They were very important people to me. So I should never walk around like, oh, it's okay, I'm done. I don't want that. I guess at the same time, I don't want to live my life with that shadow over me all the time either. I've got things to do. I've got relationships to engage in here. And obviously, I can't afford to live my life with the shadow of grief following me everywhere I go. So there's kind of I guess the word appropriate comes to mind with me, is I know I've overcome grief when I begin to live my life normally again. And for me, after mom died, it took a couple of months. There's a couple of months where every day there was a significant sting in my life. Pretty much every day there was something going on where it was still in the forefront of my mind. And then as time went by, it wasn't in the forefront anymore. It would come up and it still comes up, but it was not in the forefront. Now, how that works for each person is individual. And I'm not going to tell you 3 months is the time for you. It was for me. Um, Same with my dad, but other people, it could take longer for different reasons. So I would say be open with your friends, be open with trusted friends, talk to those who are mentoring you, be open with people who have gone through it before you have, and get an idea of what's appropriate. Good questions, man. Another question here. Okay, so this is the perfect question. How do you deal with unresolved issues in your relationship with the deceased person? Guys, that question there, whoever asked that question, I want to give you a big hug right now. That's exactly what my book is about. That's the premise of the book is this. We don't grieve well because we have unresolved issues with those that we've lost. So for instance, with my mom, one of the things for me to grieve properly is I had to resolve unresolved issues. There are still things between me and my mother that were never resolved when she died. Okay. We never talked through, she didn't like the fact I became a Christian. She made fun of me for being a fundamentalist and all that. And we never resolved that. We never talked it through for whatever reason. We just let it go. And so after she died, that was something I had to resolve with her. Um, there are things that I needed to apologize to my mom for. There are things that I had never told her about my life that hurt her for different reasons that I'd never apologized. So the whole book that I wrote ends up at the end with a letter that you write to your loved one. And you apologize to them for the things that you did wrong, and you forgive them for the things that they did wrong that were unresolved. And what we believe, at least what I believe, is that when you resolve those issues to the very best of your ability, then you can grieve properly. And so that's what that book is based upon. I got a lot of good research out of it. I didn't come up with that on my own, by the way. Other people thought of those things. Um, but that's what we do is we resolve the hurt things in our lives, and we clear those things off the table, and then we're able to have this ongoing relationship with our loved one. And I'm going to say this at the end of my book, I came up with a very innovative new thing that I got from the scriptures, and I think it's a very biblical concept, is that we have what I call an ongoing relationship with our loved one that we lost. In other words, after my mom died, I've had a relationship with her for the last 13 years. And I explain that in the book. I have an ongoing relationship with my mother, even after she died. And it's very comforting to me to know that in some ways I still walk with her. And I explained it all in my book. So, but I needed to get through those unresolved issues before I had that ongoing relationship with her. So, great question. Thank you for asking that. Is it possible that lack of compassion, patience, and gentleness makes a person who is grieving struggle or sin? Or would that be a person just looking for someone to blame? In the beginning of time, Adam and Eve struggled, however, they weren't grieving. So basically, you're saying that is it possible that if I don't have compassion and patience and gentleness to somebody else, then they're going to sin? Well, it might. You know, I've seen that a lot. People get really hurt in the church. That never gives them an excuse to sin, of course. I mean, their sin is on them. Um, they don't sin. It's not my fault they sin, but it's certainly my fault that I didn't love them. And so both things happen. I should love people, and people shouldn't sin, right? It's not one or the other. Um, I think we need to get a lot better at loving people in grief. I think as a church, I don't think we do a good job. Most churches don't have grief groups, which I think is just wrong. If we can't do grief in a church, then where are we going to do it? I was seeing way too many people go outside the church for grief. And I thought, that's not right. Why are we going outside the church to resolve grief issues? Why aren't we doing those in the church? So I think we should love people through grief, and then I think we should help people that are sinning to maybe find different ways of processing grief. How can we grieve over a living loved one who has dementia or Alzheimer's? Yeah, boy, that's an important one. So that's called anticipatory grief. You know, my mom had lung cancer, and we knew she's going to die for about 3 months. We knew it was coming. Um, so with those people, you have what's called anticipatory grief, and in some ways, it's kind of beneficial. Maybe you get to drag the grief, you get to process it for a while before that person finally passes. Um, so with my mom, it was kind of beneficial in the way that, I had some chances to go visit her, be with her, um, versus my dad, who just, went into the hospital right away and died like 3 days later. Um, so we grieve people in the way we grieve them. We grieve them in our own way. I think when they have dementia or Alzheimer's, it's essential to get as much time as you can with them. Even though they may not be cognizant, oftentimes they will come in and out of their dementia, and they might be lucid for a while, and you might get some really valuable time. The other thing is you get to at least tell them while they live what you think about them. When my dad was dying, he was in the hospital. I stayed up with him all night that night. And I told him, he was in a coma, but I told him I loved him. I read him the Psalms. And I remember one time a nurse came by and she looked at me, she said, "You know what? He can hear you." And this was a hospice nurse. She knew about people dying. She said, "He hears you, what you're saying right now. Even though he's not responding to you, he can hear what you're saying." And that gave me great comfort that I could say things to my dad that were really helping him out. So please continue to be with those people as you grieve. What are your thoughts on grief counseling? Do you have a website that you can suggest? Yeah, there's some really good websites out there that address grief. One's called Grief Share. Um, they have some really good resources. It's a Christian-based grief ministry that's really good. Um, Again, I don't think you should go for grief counseling unless you have complicated grief. In other words, my feeling is that grief, normal grief, is something that we all go through. It's a normal life activity that we're designed to go through. So I don't think grief counseling is necessary if your church or your people around you are loving and loving you in this way. So my personal conviction is that in church we should be able to do most of this work. Now, again, if you've got complicated grief or complex grief or your depression is really kicking up, then yes, please go get professional counseling. But generally speaking, most people I know can deal with their grief in the church setting. I lost a friend last November. I suspected suicide, but I said I don't want to know for sure. This has prevented me from reaching out to her family. I'm already feeling like I wasn't good enough friend to her, and I'm going to feel worse once the suicide is confirmed. How do I deal with the situation? I'm often overcome by guilt. I'm so sorry, you guys. I'm just sorry that you're going through this, whoever it is. It's a really tough place to be. Here's my advice I give churches is sometimes we have suicide in the church, and the church doesn't tell the leaders don't tell the church it was suicide, and that's not good. That's wrong. And I'll tell you why. First of all, you always want permission from the family. If you're a church leader and there's been a suicide, you want permission from the parents or the loved or the closest people if it's okay to announce it. Sometimes it's not okay. And during those times, I'd say don't announce it. But most of the time, the family is okay with it. And the best thing is for people to know, because if you're not honest with people about it, then when they find out later that it was suicide, then you've lost credibility. people start seeing you as a leader, as somebody that's not being honest. So I encourage churches, if they're allowed to go ahead and announce. With Nick Thompson, we talked about it right away. We were very upfront about it with the church. The parents wanted us to be upfront, and it really helped people to deal with it squarely. It took away some of this guilt that people were feeling. You know what? Suicide is something that you're not responsible for. People have to make their decision on that. Even though we help people in suicide, we help them not to do it. If people want to take their lives, they do it. And at some level, you're probably going to want to go through some good counseling or at least a good grief group to resolve this guilt that you've got, but you're not guilty, okay? You are not responsible for that person's decision. So I would encourage you to get back to the family and be as vulnerable as you can and ask that question. And you can phrase it by saying, you know what, this is really hard for me to ask this, but I have to ask, do you know if this loss was a suicide, if he committed suicide? And then go from there.
Hey, Tim, this is
Yeah,
James. Can I, on that note, can I just ask, I know you mentioned before about the church having a suicide protocol.
yeah.
Um, is there any way you can direct us to that information, or um, is that more specific to like Denver?
No, that's one of my workshops I do. It's called We Stand in the Gap of Suicide Ideation. And I teach about suicide, but then I meet with the leaders of the teen group and the college group leaders, and really anybody that wants to come, but those two groups are the biggest ones. And I have a protocol because, and here's why, James, in a church setting, in our DNA, we're honest with each other. We have this DNA of being vulnerable and honest. And so I don't think it's right to have people be vulnerable and honest about suicide, and then we don't do anything about it that day. So in the high school setting that I work in, we're not allowed to let that go. If we have any inkling of suicide ideation, we stop everything we're doing and we go into a very strict protocol to get the help needed that day. We're not allowed to wait till the next day or anything. We always bring parents into the campus that day to deal with it. So what I've decided is, given that in church, people are honest, we have to have something set up to help them right then and there. So what I do is I help churches set up a protocol. It's very easy, actually, so that if, let's say, a high school kid, you can imagine, here's a high school boy who's 15 years old. He gets with his discipler one night, who's a college kid, and he tells that discipler, hey, I've thought about killing myself. And the discipler goes, well, I'm sorry to hear that. Let's pray about it. And that's it. Well, first of all, it's not very ethical to do that. Secondly, can you imagine the liability in the church has for that? The kid goes home and completes suicide, and then the parents find out that the kid actually confessed that earlier in the day. Oh my gosh. And that's what happens in schools at times. If they don't have a suicide protocol, the counselor goes, hey, let's talk about it tomorrow. The kid goes home and completes. And then the parents are like, your school knew about this and didn't call me? So we set up a protocol of how to get help that night or that day. And guys, it's super important. We've had way too many suicides in our churches. In Denver, we've had 5 in the last 20 years of active church members. They're not all people that have left the church. Some of them are active church members. So anyways, yeah, I'd love to help out. Usually what I can do is I can do a Zoom training for the staff on that. But yeah, I'm pretty fired up about that one.
That's great. Thank you.
Let's do one more question and then we'll close out.
Yeah. So this last one, guys, it's just heartbreaking. Basically, my mom died on New Year's Eve, and during the COVID-19, we haven't been able to have funerals. We haven't been able to do the traditional things that help us during grief, and it is heartbreaking. And then we look around at the world around us, and it's doubly heartbreaking because we see so much other stuff. How do we engage in grief during so much distraction? Well, first of all, I'm really happy that you found Grief Share. They've got a lot of great resources, and I think it'll really help you a lot. Um, I think it's just going to be a little bit more incumbent upon you to keep engaging it. So, I don't know if Grief Share right now, if they're doing Zoom meetings. They're a wonderful group. Um, I think the other thing is maybe I would love to talk to you about getting a grief journey group started in your church. That might help you to kind of focus your grief a little bit. Um, but I would say keep doing what you're doing. Keep researching out those resources that help you. And when you find stuff that helps you, man, just stay with it. Um, yeah, I think you're doing what you're supposed to do, and it's not unusual what's happening to you. This is pretty common. So hang in there. And if I can help, shoot me an email. I'd be more than happy to respond to any, maybe some more specifics. So guys, again, thank you, thank you, thank you. I appreciate so much your hearts. And when all this stuff's over with, I'm pretty sure I'll be coming out to New York for a weekend visit. And I look forward to meeting a lot of you guys face to face. So thank you.
Amen. Well, big thanks to you, Tim. This was fantastic. As I mentioned before, and as Jay mentioned, you're a trooper. I mean, that was, 2 workshops back to back, and answered all of our questions, and so just appreciate that so much. And we are looking forward to having you out whenever we can. So
Cool.
looking forward to that. So I'm going to close this out with prayer, and that'll be our time together for today. So let's go to God in prayer.
Hey, Ryan, we have tomorrow afternoon, right? With the leaders?
With the leaders tomorrow.
Okay,
Yeah,
good. I just want to make sure. Okay, good. Thank you.
Yep, 2 p.m. You got it. All right. Let's pray. Father, we come to you at this time just so grateful for your deep love for us, God, for your comfort, your grace, the many ways in which you bless us and love us, especially in challenging and difficult times. I want to say just a big thank you for your servant Tim, the many ways in which you've blessed him and helped him to navigate difficulties in his life with grief and anxiety, the training that you've given him, the gift of teaching and counseling, and just the fact that he used his gifts here today and his experiences and those things to help us. I mean, what a tremendous blessing and gift to us. And so a big thank you for that. Thank you so much that we have this technology that we are able to get together and be together in this way, though we are social distancing, physical distancing, quarantining. It is such a gift that we can still come together as a community in times like this for special opportunities like this. God, I pray that we'll take what was shared today, the things from your spirit, and we go back and reflect on those things and put those things into practice, the things that you would have us do to help us navigate these difficulties in life with anxiety and grief and other challenges as well. I pray that you'd continue to enable us to be the community that you have called us to be, where we can engage our own grief and fight through anxiety and other difficulties, and that we can reach out for the help that we need from one another, and that we can be there for one another, that we can be the community that you've called us to be, and that we can be a bright shining light for you in a dark world. Please work through us in that way. God, again, just a big thank you for this time together. So grateful for Jesus, and just all the ways that he works in our lives and helps us. I just pray that we'd continue to walk closely with him, because I know that he desires to be close with us. We love you, God, and again, thank you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Okay, guys. See you later.
All right.
Thanks.